All right. So I'm really excited for this conversation. I got the Big Sig with me, Andrew
What's going
Flores.
on?
um, I sort of approached you with this big idea of how do we breach these seemingly dis asymmetrical oppositional things that perhaps have no um, similarity with each other, like virtue ethics and psychoanalysis. And I sort of came out of the woodwork to you with this kind of proposal of like, another project that I'm working on, but then I realized like we have to talk about this distinction between the beauty and the good. And my initial proposal to you is just like laying out the ground was like, okay, the work that's being done between some of my buddies like Daniel Gardner, Andrew Luber, Thomas Jockin is that beauty and good are completely separate. For the longest time, we've made this kind of collapse of the three transcendentals, beauty, truth, and goodness. Thomas Jockin, for example, he likes to think of them like concentric circles, except beauty is like the bigger one. Um, and I reached out to you because I was trying to think what are the potential agreements between virtue ethics? Can there be a virtue ethics with psychoanalysis? Um, and I sort of proposed an initial agreement point, which is that I was thinking that because good is related to desire, and Aquinas even says this, um, that psychoanalysis has the position that it has because it sees that goodness itself is so problematic precisely because of the problem of desire. So I'm just going to lay that out there and see what comes up for you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was really excited when you came up to me with this question because like I guess this is something that I've always like thought about. Not even though like I've kind of just oriented myself I would say for the rest of my life with psychoanalysis, like my upbringing as an autodidact and as a scholar was in philosophy and thinking about like ancient Greek philosophy, then to like modern philosophy with Kant, Descartes, Nietzsche. I mean, then in the existentialist thought or phenomenological thought, prior to even getting into psychoanalysis or more like Marxism and other forms of like critic theory. Um, but like, yeah, the question concerning ethics was always something that I was kind of more like perplexed by, at a young age, even though metaphysics is badass, whether or not like people they want to go beyond metaphysics, I still think metaphysics is fun to learn, like the classic metaphysicians, Aristotle, the list goes on, like Leibniz. Um, but yeah, like I think he threw out like a lot, which is, you know, needs some context with regards to psychoanalysis because it's not just virtue ethics that psychoanalysis is contention is has a contention with, or at least like exposes like limitations. I would say it's all forms of ethics that, I mean, you listed this thing about like the good and the beautiful. And if I know we always have like in philosophy to define our terms, but I think just for the sake of the conversation, from the various people that you're conversing with, like Daniel Garner and others in the OG Rose Circle, I imagine, the beauty is like bigger than truth that's on the side of the good, or good is on the side of the truth versus beauty, which is an even bigger thing.
So,
Just just so I understand.
yeah. So it would be beauty's the bigger than good than truth.
Mhm. Okay. It's
Yeah.
almost like the original like Platonic thing of like the good, the one, and the beautiful.
Yeah, almost. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, it's almost, yeah, like that like triangulation. But yeah, like, you know, because when you look at like, and this might be an overgeneralization, but like when you look at like you know, ethics like from, you know, like after Plato, during the time of Plato, like the dialogues, um, and even like Aristotelian ethics, this striving at the good, right? At least for Aristotelian ethics and after Aristotle, um, eudaimonia, which is, you know, aiming at the good life or the ultimate good, which would then, you know, come to like sunum bonum and like Italian thought and the sort of Latinization of Aristotelian thinking. And then you have like, for instance, the Stoics with like a similar theme, but I think it's apatheia, right? To be able to have sort of control over one's, you know, temperaments. Um, and then you got like ataraxia on the other end, which is not necessarily aligned with virtue so much, but as you know, this sort of hedonism, this balance of like what is pleasurable and unpleasurable. And then, you know, of course, the list goes on. You got deontology from Kant, you know, duty, and then like utilitarianism as like, you know, whoever has the most good versus like the most pain. And Lacan, you know, going back to Freud, is looking at all these different trends of ethics. Um, Going back to the whole Socratic thing, he mentions in Seminar 2 that like Socrates, in a sense, is like a sort of paved the way for like decentering, you know, the Athenian ideal of the arete of self excellence. That was like the sort of like orthodoxy of thought. In orthodoxy is like it's the sort of common, you know, ideology or the common like sentiment that, you know, one, and I think he's like talking about like, for instance, the dialogue in Seminar 2 that he's referring to is the Meno of whether virtue can be taught, if I'm not mistaken, right? Just because virtue can be taught, and in a sense, like this whole thing is like, well, if like, you know, I know it, like, why would I need to be taught it, right? Why would I need to learn something that's like sort of like innate? I know it's kind of like a little like paraphrasing of the dialogue, but I mean Lacan's point was that like Socrates, in a sense, was like wanted the future to do this movement of decentering, which would then come into you know, modern science, where something like decentering takes its place as the Copernican revolution, decentering the Earth as the center of the universe, because the sun it orbits around the sun, and the sun too is in motion, this Galilean shift, which confirms Copernicus. And then you see it in Kant, you know, with the faculties of understanding and the transcendental critique. And then you see it in Freud, which is to decenter man as the center of the universe as well. And so, like, what I guess Lacan, I'm trying to say what Lacan is doing is like practicing like a sort of like groundwork to like where we can even talk about like, human aim. We have to understand we're already centered, right, in this Copernican shift. And for Freud, that's simple because uh, philosophy has always privileged consciousness in relationship to thought and thinking. But for Freud, he realizes that the unconscious has its own type of thinking, which decenters the ego, and even conflating the ego as consciousness. And I guess to go back to what, you know, what we talk about in terms of like what's problematic with, I guess, ethics as a whole, not just virtue, but I know virtue is the main thing that you're thinking about. Is like, you know, the problem of striving at the good when we're always undermining that. And I think the main thing, if I'm not mistaken, that is I'm gonna mention Aristotle because it's I said striving, but it's like we aim right at the truth, or we aim at the good, and aim is the sort of thing that is privileged over the object aimed at in psychoanalysis when it comes to the unconscious. You mentioned desire, right?
Yeah.
Desire, I think desire is a way that in psychoanalytic theory and in technique, when we orient the analyzan through their speech and free association around the movement towards desire, we're able to get at something. But that's also to show where like it fails, and that's because of the drive. And the drive is what has a source, it has an aim, and it has an object to which it creates as well. And so when we think about like the problem of aiming at the good is also the drive which misses its own object and yet it gets satisfaction. It's also funny that you mentioned this topic with me because I mentioned Kant, and I'm in a study group right now reading Kant and Sade. And so, for your viewers who may not know that essay, it's an essay written by Lacan that's published in a Decree about saying that that Sade, Marquis de Sade, the French novelist and libertine, is the truth of Kant, but Kant is not necessarily, the truth of Sade. It's not this like symmetrical relationship, like, oh, Kant is low key a sadist. No, that's not it at all. In a sense, like he's exposing, so it's like twofold. It's like one, this essay is kind of exposing that, like, unlike someone like let's say Simone de Beauvoir, Kolakowski, I forget, he's another French writer like Bataille, who's not necessarily a philosopher per se, but just sort of like a thinker in that milieu, who wrote on Nietzsche and Sade, and then Bataille as well, where they kind of see Sade as like not just this sort of libertine for like thinking of a new sort of counterculture revolution, but also in a sense a nihilistic type of thinker. Whereas Lacan says like, no, he's in the tradition of the French Revolution, criticizing the failures of the revolutions and even the Jacobins, and thinking about how this idea of libertinism, using the kind of like flipping Kant on his head and extracting like the kernel of Kant into a sort of libertine republic, to which not only does one follow the categorical imperative, but also that one has the right to say, I have a right to enjoy your body, right? Which becomes kind of problematic. Now we're still going through the essay, and it's tough. It's tough. But I think one of the things that like Lacan shows, not only like with some of the intricacies of Kant's categorical imperative of aligning with not only duty, but the duty that's in relationship with the goodwill, right? And the sort of subject who's trying to who's split between a goodwill, right? And then the pathological aspect, which is sort of eliding, the possibility of the goodwill. And he shows that in a sense, like, if I'm understanding, because this shit is hard, Sade is like the one who kind of shows like, well, if I maximize this sort of imperative in the libertine sense to again, what is least talked about in philosophy. And so, like in this text philosophy, the bedroom, which is written by Sade, it's this idea that like you have the academy in Plato, and then what's the one that Aristotle built? I forget the name of that one. The Lyceum.
Yep.
That the bedroom is Sade's version of the Lyceum, where and I'll get to my point because it's interesting that for Kant, right, he kind of goes beyond, the sort of problematics, you could say, of virtue, ethics, and even hedonism, because the two people that he's inspired by are Plato and Epicurus, and he wants to kind of go beyond, these sort of two ways of thinking when it comes to something like ethics. But also, he's just surrounded by a whole bunch of other ethical thinkers in the liberal tradition, and even someone like Rousseau with social contract theory. But for Sade, right, Sade actually, in my opinion, is not only sort of the truth of Kant, like Lacan would say, but in a sense, and this is just my sort of speculation. I brought it to our group, is Daniel's group. That's interesting that Sade is anti. He thinks the problem is just like this sort of kernel of Christianity that still lingers within, the French milieu of his time, and like with the Jacobins and early socialism and all these things. This is why he's a political thinker. He's not like a nihilistic thinker. That this sense of like seeing the embrace of the other and the sexual act, which is also a form of education in the bedroom that is the academy and the Lyceum, as also an initiation into Venus or these other like paganized thinkers, to which virtue is also a sort of quality that's being developed. Like there is a weird virtue that's being cultivated in a sort of return to virtue in a weird way, by Saad's sort of libertinism and the embrace of education and even the form of cruelty, and how a lot of his victims in the stories that he writes about, like so like Justine and all the other ones, like there's like a sort of sublimity to the cruelty that they endure while following their own like ethical code. So it's kind of interesting to see that. I guess like in this ramble, what I'm trying to say is like when we even think about like notions of virtue and beauty and the good, and how like someone like Saad or Lacan tries to fit that to the T, but we end up into this sort of weird logic where like for Kant, right, even though he's not a virtue ethicist, he's the one who follows duty, universalizing one's maxim. And it's really the duty, because it's like, if I understand, it's like the duty alone that you're universalizing as a maxim, and not grounding it on the basis of the consequences, but that it's logically sound that anybody could do it, right? um and versus like Saad, who for Saad, like it's interesting, like Saad's thing seems similar, but then at the end it also seems like there's some quality where like the act does and the effect does matter. And that like there is a form of like culture or education that comes out to, even if like it's purely pathological in the state of masochistic acts that are being talked about, or like in the philosophy of the bedroom. Like I've only read some of it so far, but like treating the bedroom as this sort of like educational scene. But I guess like what does that have to do with like Lacan? Well, like I guess Lacan is trying to show like the importance of, we're going to get into psychoanalytic technique and theory now, and step away from philosophy, but like this idea of like of jouissance, the drive, and sexuality, and all those things. What does that have to do with that? Well, this is the one thing that I guess like as ethics is concerned for psychoanalysis, and I may be repeating myself, but we talked about how like in terms of the drive sort of undermines itself, or the subject is undermined by the death drive, this compulsion to repeat from attaining the good. And I think I should also add that this is a form of suffering. So like it's if there's something that is in relation to psychoanalysis via ethics, we have to take into account that we're dealing with analyzans, people, patients, whatever term you want to use, that suffer, right? It's not just like they just feel like, oh, I didn't get the good object, or I didn't obtain beauty. It's like, no, there's people that are suffering. But in fantasy, especially for neurotics, in their dream formation or in their fantasies that they talk about, sexual or just other ones like romantic fantasies, there is a sense where like there is the sort of other that they will be, or like this beautiful or desirable thing. And I guess one thing to also add too, with not only the problem of the drive, the inability to gain the object one desires, um, which is related to the drive, and this object is libidinally invested. It's a sort of sexual object, one that is constantly being, sort of sublimated in the process, because sublimation is also a form of satisfaction in the drive. And we could probably get into that more as we get into the talk. So I'm just laying out stuff right there.
Right.
And I assume an audience, but I also probably assume that you get a lot of people who probably are not familiar with all the jargon and lingo of psychoanalytic theory, but it's fine. We can break that down later. One of the things that I kind of want to mention, because I'm riffing off like certain seminars that I've sort of studying at the moment. And so with like seminar 7, desire, sublimation, Content Exoter talked about in there, and the law, because it has to do with the law. Seminar 16 in jouissance, and Pascal is talked about a lot in that one too, and perversion. And then seminar 8, which is everybody's favorite because it has to do with love and the transference. And the symposium is referred to like pretty much from front and back of that seminar. But this idea of love is not like a sort of crazy philosophical, discourse on love. It's simple as just, the fact that humans love, romantic love, all that thing. It's not like a crazy, like, philosophical concept. But the implications of love are interesting for Lacan. And I know you mentioned Thomas Aquinas, but in Seminar 8, he mentions that, like, uh, I think is it desire that he says it's like to aim at the good, or is it love is to love what, or to desire what is good, or also to wish one good as well? Because I know there's some reference that Lacan talks about with Thomas Aquinas regarding um to love someone is also to wish them good, in good health, right? um
Mm.
but for Lacan, this idea of love, which is related to what's called transference in
Mhm.
psychoanalytic technique, which comes from Freud as early as his papers on the transference, where transference can just be, because it's a complicated concept to define, the desire that's provoked from the relationship between the patient and the doctor, as Freud will say, or the analysand and the analyst, where it is constructed through the act of speaking, certain projections and images of feeling like this person is like a father image that I have on at the level of the unconscious, a mother image, brother, whatever, uh, or certain things that come up that make me feel like I have butterflies in the stomach. But it's not like as if it is sort of uh, exactly love, in the sense when I fall in love with you know somebody that I will soon go out with and have a life. There's something similar to it, but the difference is that the psychoanalytic transference that is constructed, and this sort of traversing through love, is an artificial one, because of the interventions and the technique of interpretations that the analyst uses, because he's not trying to uh uh you know uh distance himself and be super cold, but he's not trying to um, fulfill the analyst's wish in love, and marry them, right, and complete them. No, because then you're not doing analysis either. Because if you're separating from them, then you don't have the love provoking from the transference. But if you get too close, well, then you're not doing analysis anymore. You just got duped and fell in love with a desiring patient that's like expressing pathologies. Uh, so why am I talking about this? Well, because this is exactly what's interesting about not only love, but maybe also can bring out questions and clarifications concerning the problem of ethics. And again, I forget that Saint the Thomas Aquinas quote in that chapter on Seminar 8. But we could see how, for him, both love and in the sort of settings of the romantic love dynamic, and then also in the transference, it does not get reduced to this setting of intersubjectivity, where I recognize the other person as a subject like myself, but the lover and the beloved, this asymmetrical relationship where
Mhm.
I don't love the person really. I love what is in them that is more than them. And you probably heard this from Zizek. Zizek
Yeah.
says this a lot. Um, this is related to something that you will see in Lacan in the seminars, like 9 all the way up, called the object petit a, or object cause of desire. The something that escapes my imaginary and symbolic relationship with the world and the other, that at the same time is real and causes my desire, but I also don't get the thing, because really is a sort of fantasy prop in my relationship to fantasy that kind of hides the core of my being, a traumatic real, a traumatic lack. And in the transference dynamic and in the romantic love dynamic, this thing is projected as something good and beautiful that I know and they don't. I know that they have something that I lack, but yet I don't acknowledge that I lack, and therefore my that is sustaining my desire. And they see themselves as someone and don't recognize they're seen as something, or someone that has something, right? That's the distinction that he makes out. Um, it's in a sense that we don't have a subject to subject relationship. We have a subject to an object relationship. But to qualify that, this is not the same as like in philosophy when we talk about the subject object dichotomy of the of you or we say of epistemology. Um, this is more of the fact of a dynamic that is happening between a subject of the unconscious, right? And you could say what the fulfillment of the wish is, to use Freudian terms, or what the unconscious fantasy is, and what is provoking lack, desire, and this impossibility of getting that, and the compulsion repetition of the drive. Um, and I guess like to tie that back to what I was saying earlier about like the convict sod thing, is that like what's interesting about what makes someone repeat, and it's not necessarily tied to perversion, although for perversion and someone who is like a sort of Sadian law, they instrumentalize themselves as the sort of good thing and want to plug the gap and inconsistency and lack in the other, and it is in a way that's sort of cruel, cold, and impersonal. But uh, this law that makes someone continue to go and continually desire and fail is inverted by the and absorbed by the superego, which is on the side of the voice that still provokes you to repeat, right? This external voice, which is also in seminar 11, the thing that I talked about, the object cause of desire, the thing that's not located in this my necessarily symbolic and imaginary relations, but kind of escapes. It's like a hole. It's a gap, whether in myself, I see in the way of myself, or in the coordinates of my reality that I'm embedded in. The voice of objet as the form of the superego come about and say enjoy, enjoy. Of course, this is the typical Lacanian thing, and he kind of ties that in with the commodity, like Coca-Cola. Usually, how commodities do that, say this is it, right? Coke, Coke Zero, enjoy, or as Michael Downs will say, get it right, like this cruel, pernicious thing that just says to keep going, get it right, just do it, just do it. There's no rationality, just do it because this, and the third will happen. It's just do it. Uh, get it right, enjoy. This senseless, tyrannical thing that wants you to enjoy too much, and also when you can't enjoy enough, the guilt and shame that arises from that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's good. That's a lot. No, but that's good. This is good.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to like lay out some groundworks too to show like some of the elements that could you know because again like I know you have a dialogue with a lot of these people that are great philosophers. They're into philosophy,
Yeah.
into ethics, trying to talk about beauty and the good, and they have some gripes with psychoanalysis. And I will say, like, again, psychoanalysis is not philosophy, and all these concepts that I've talked about, besides technique, and the only technical concept I did talk about was technique as practice, is transference. But what the other concepts I talk about, like unconscious, drive, desire, the other objet petit, these are what are enveloped in what Freud and then Lacan will take on, what Freud developed called metapsychology.
Right.
Now, metapsychology, I like to use the sort of simple definition that Adrian Johnson uses at the beginning of his time-driven text, where he says that Freud's metapsychology is the theory for psychoanalysis, which is able to investigate and expose the limits of science in all its forms and empirical forms, as well as to pose questions that are being evoked by philosophy in ontology. And
Right.
of course, one of the ones is the unconscious, and to privilege unconscious thinking and unconscious memory over conscious one, and a sort of agent, subject, or cogito whose thinking is primacy, or maybe if we wanted Merleau-Ponty, it's perception, but consciousness is the center, right? Everything happens at the site of consciousness, versus unconscious thinking, which for the unconscious, it's structured like a language, or it's structured like a sort of memory algorithm for Freud. He also has this sort of topography in his later years, like 1920 something, I like 27 or 28, called the Mystic Writing Pad, which is
Remember that.
literally just like his day's version of an etch a sketch, where it's like, a memory is simply a trace of another trace of something that's kind of absent of a wish, of a certain idea or formation, that through the analytic technique, and also interpreting not only the fantasy that's being spoken about, but the dreams, formulate. And it has no basis to an actual event or something existing in the external world, but sort of residues of you could say, of things that don't work in one symbolic function, almost like they're jettisoned out like entropy, and they sort of recreate a scene for desire, or for fantasy to keep fulfilling itself. But there's always gaps in clusters and inconsistencies. And so, like, this also ties into another early essay, which I feel like, if you're like a savvy reader of Freud, like Lacan is, you see this older essay kind of be completed by the Mystic Writing Pad, which is called Stream Memory, in which his idea of memory is that a memory is not about, and this is for like unconscious memory, is not about something that it was about the past, but it's rather something that is presently being formulated, right? The past is being presently formulated, and continually worked through and lived through. Um, I guess the best sort of illustration we could think about that, I think it's a really good one, is like Silent Hill, if you've ever played the Silent Hill games. So in the first Silent Hill, that's actually a real, like, you're really going to Silent Hill. This is a real existing city. But in the other ones, we don't know if that's it's actually real. But at the same time, we have like these you're playing these main characters that have amnesia, and like, in a sense, like they don't really suffer from amnesia, but they cannot remember their past, or who they are, or who their identity is, and their identity about who they are, who their family members were, are reconstructed by traversing Silent Hill, right?
Mm,
Um, and
okay.
so, in a way, in analysis, you're kind of doing the same thing, where you're traversing some of the gaps and inconsistencies about the trauma, desire, sexuality as it relates to the drive and libido, to recreate a sort of scene that's like at the heart. This is the unconscious subject. This is the message that it's saying to a field of knowledge that is stuck and oriented around, which is the other, right? And I think right here, this is where we could even like tie in, like, really why I like reading Lacan on his own and Freud versus reading him through the Slovene school. Like, I know, like, everybody's gotten like their like ideas, and gotten acquainted with Lacan, because he's hard to understand, and hard to read. He's difficult through like Zizek and Todd McGowan and everybody else. And I think they've done a lot of work, but I think like this understanding of the big other is getting conflated with like societal law, which is not the case. The big other represents a field of knowledge, to which is already signified,
Hmm.
and the subject, a split subject, who is absent, who needs a signifier, addresses and intervenes on this problematic field of knowledge.
Mm.
This is also pretty much the formula in his math themes. If you've seen like the discourse theory of the unconscious is never it's never this subject fully immediately present. It's absent in its discourse, and represented by a signifier that's addressing really the discourse of it all, which is the other. And this is why like the subject is an alienated subject, because it's alienated by the other, which is a field of signifiers, a chain that is constantly being intervened by a signifier addressing this chain or battery bank or field of knowledge. And this knowledge, as I'll elaborate on, is precisely this famous dictum by Lacan, that desire is the desire of the other or of the other's desire. And that is within this chain of knowledge, the big other.
Right.
Or also knowledge of jouissance, which is the other side of knowledge, is jouissance. And in the process, I can never attain it. So there's always a surplus. And so we have the surplus because it doesn't work. This is entropy. This is what is jettisoned out. This is excess. This is waste. In the same way for Freud, in memory, certain things don't work, so they have to be jettisoned out, right? This is Lacan just using different terms to talk about something that Freud discovered, but couldn't think of like in a more sort of materialist way, in a certain way. So like he didn't have linguistics, he didn't have the idea of the sign or the signifier. So Lacan inverting Saussurian signifier to privilege the signifier over the signified in binary structure, we could understand how the signifier operates with the problem of knowledge as a field. I mean, you could see this even in philosophy. The signifier represents the subject for another signifier, is Lacan's definition of the signifier. The other signifier that is being addressed is this field of signifiers. And that one that is intervening is one that's specifically the symptom of the subject, the split subject. In philosophy, we could see this play out as Descartes, whose doubt addresses the field of truth, which is guaranteed by God, right? That's philosophy's, symptom right there that Lacan is showing. And not only philosophy, but also the inauguration of science, because the psychoanalytic subject is also the subject of science who's split by knowledge and truth, right? And forecloses itself as a subject because it's so focused on a field of truth, a field of meaning, to where I could extract knowledge from little by little. But my model's always going to be incomplete. My models fail. My models always fall into contradiction and paradoxes. And we see this not only in quantum mechanics, but we also see this in mathematics itself, as mathematics for Lacan is like the sort of way in which science tries to inaugurate itself with writing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you saw my conversation where but we talked about set theory. And so in a way, this is how you see like math taking its importance for science as far as writing and discourse.
Are you pulling it up? Or
Oh no. I was just waiting to see if you had anything to.
Oh. Yeah, I got tons. Man. Okay. So where to begin? Okay. So there is one, so it's interesting is I took note of you saying the big other people conflate with being society, law. It's really about, it's a field of knowledge. Okay.
Or I should say it's the field of truth, and through our knowledge, through our construction of a model of knowledge, we try to ascertain that, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. We try to ascertain that. Okay.
Yeah.
So what's always been a little fishy about Cartesianism, and I know once psychoanalysis gets on the scene, it gets like into like a funnier, like not funny like haha, but like it's a more strange Cartesianism. Like it's not Cartesianism flat face forward, but I feel like a lot of psychoanalysis is responding to that kind of Cartesianism. But what's interesting is when you go back to like before Descartes, there becomes this like really increasing anxiety about the certainty of God's existence. So like Descartes' like, hold on, we can prove God's existence through math. and he's like really fixated on that. But if we go back further, we go to like, I think it's like right after Aquinas. It like really starts like after Aquinas. My friend Joachim will tell me. It's when we get into like nominalism with like God, what's his name? I cannot picture his name. He's also the guy that's like simplicity's the best principle.
Oh, Occam's razor, right?
Is it Occam's razor? Yeah, he's a part of that movement. There's somebody else too, but anyways, that's good enough. So yeah, so we start getting to this nominalism kind of thing, and the whole freak out is that God.
Duns Scotus. You're thinking
yes,
Duns Scotus.
Duns Scotus. Yes, Duns Scotus. So Duns Scotus is kind of on that train, not fully, but like he kind of leads up to the Occam's razor kind of extension. So they start having this crazy uncertainty about God because they start asking this question of like, well, hold on. If it's God, isn't it possible that God could have made it in other ways? Like, couldn't God have made the universe in other ways? And they start having this debate about things could be otherwise. So then basically, Duns Scotus starts asserting this idea of univocity. It couldn't have been otherwise. And then you see how it starts translating into like Occam's razor, the simplest explanation. It has to be the simplest one. That is certain. So what's interesting about this break between the analogia entis and going from nominalism and then to like Descartes is they don't accept the analogia entis because they don't accept the radical uncertainty that it sort of requires. So like when we say God is good, actually I have no clue what that means. I have no idea what that means. I only have a human conception of what that possibly means.
Yeah, a principle of analogy, right?
Right, yeah, principle of analogy. I only have an idea of what that means. So then it makes me think that, and then also I really like Aquinas's kind of starting point, because I'm wondering if I could shoot this ball right now. I wonder if I could make this gymnastic move right here of psychoanalysis, metapsychology, trying to draw out the limits of science is quite analogous to the way Aquinas defines theology itself. Because for Aquinas, the limits of science was supposed to be the limits of reason. Faith was supposed to be the super added principle after reason. And then, of course, we have revelation. But I think, and this is my opinion, I think the most intellectually honest position is the agnostic one. And I think Aquinas, I think I can argue this from Aquinas, because the most intellectually honest position is the agnostic one, because we can't, like Aquinas already says, we cannot prove God's existence. It can only be proven, quote, quote, through these effects. So already we're coming across what we might call the limits of reason. And I would say, like, in conjunction with this, the limits of science, the field of knowledge itself. But I do think the moment that you get to Descartes and what psychoanalysis is responding to, I do think the moment that happens, because Descartes makes that move of like, well, we got to be certain. Psychoanalysis, in my opinion, responds correctly, because then it does become like a big other. Now there's more to this, because I do think I do think here's my position and my honest position at this point, because psychoanalysis is such a heavy weight with ethics. I think the only competing rival to psychoanalysis is a kind of theological framing. Like, because the theological framing and both the philosophical framing, psychoanalysis sees something wrong with philosophy, which has to do with knowledge. Theology sees something wrong with philosophy. Why? Because it has exactly something to do with knowledge. Now the difference is for like theology is that knowledge has this kind of, it's not about you knowing, it's about the quality of the knower. Once you start going into like St. John of the Cross, it's about the quality of the knower. I think psychoanalysis has that same kind of vibe of like, it's not really about you knowing, it's about the quality of the knower. It's about you not knowing. So I'm trying to ring in some things that you said to try to find some possible rings of agreement where psychoanalysis, and it almost seems like the way you framed it almost seems like actually philosophy under virtue is just not tenable. And like in any shape or form, it's just not tenable. But when you brought this up more, once we start going to theology, psychoanalysis, now it gets interesting. Now it gets interesting in the sense of like how tenable, how agreeable do they really become? And I think what's interesting, and this is also this is actually my gripe with virtue ethics, is something I've talked to kind of offline with some of my buddies, which is the aspect of the unconscious is so pivotal, in my opinion, that something like, let's say, virtue ethics just needs to take account of ignorance as a bigger part of its structure. Ignorance needs to be like, we need to elaborate on that concept of ignorance. And I think psychoanalysis can elaborate on that concept of ignorance. But this idea of drive that you talk about, and this is why I felt like at this point we can only talk, because I think for a lot of philosophy earliest times was theology. They were always already flirting with it, talking about it. Drive undermining the very good that I go for and allowing me to suffer. I feel like in theological terms, that's purification. That's purifying my desire. Because whatever I want, whatever I think I want, cannot be it. So drive, I think, is a very interesting, like it kind of functions as like this kind of purifier of desire, especially if it's undermining the very good that I am trying to do. And I think it's interesting because it's kind of like one of those things of like, isn't drive the very thing that helps virtue persist as virtue precisely because it helps you escape your own self-irony, which is to say, I don't get cocky because I'm doing good. Because the moment I feel like I'm doing good, I just undermined myself. I now ironically don't have humility anymore. Humility only seems to persist in this exact undermining of myself. Of every time I try to do something, it fails.
Yeah. I will say though, it's interesting. One of Lacan's favorite virtues is modesty. He says that's the one that he advocates for. And I think the modesty thing has to do with the problem of shame and how it seems like the more jouissance is, for lack of a better term, an expenditure, something that can be quantified, calculated with Latus, which is this concept that he creates about like the sort of gadgets of enjoyment that the capitalist discourse and even just like our intermingling within the social bond, which is structured around discourse, is able to create. So we become like, in a sense, sort of like islands of jouissance. And it's always easy to think of Latus as like a sort of like because he uses the term recording device, that like it's our technology, it's our phone. But I think it's more beyond that. It's more the fact that uh we can now easily quantify, calculate, and create little modes of jouissance because the in a sense it's like the way I've seen it, and I don't know if I'm certain by this, but like from my work with Seminar 16 and 17, and I'm doing my own project on Seminar 16. He uses this topic called or this concept called the absolutization of the market, right? And this is because of capitalism,
Right.
uh, uh, and all the social relations, the class struggles and stuff like that. This is like where he's like really in his Marxist phase, but that because of the dominance of the university discourse and the way that it's able to assimilate science, and to at this juncture be able to marry the discourse of science with the absolutization of the market, where it's like now it's like science's uncertainty uh seems to be concealed by the fact that now its knowledge has met with jouissance, because now it can help capitalism create commodities in different ways that it's never created before, right? So that's one thing, and I think like with that, there's this sort of collapse in our sort of otherness, or our relationship to the big other, to which when I see myself and my own desire, there's a sense of shame because I lack modesty, and with modesty and the responsibility that I take to be able to um, work on my desire, uh, or in the terms you use, the sort of like process of purification. Because, I mean, we could talk about that more. I want to kind of go back to the beginning. I do think that there is this interesting sort of relationship that Lacan has with the mythics, and we'll talk more about that. But I want to kind of address like the beginning, and then we can work our way back to this. Um, I just didn't remember if I actually said that fact, but like Lacan, yeah, he had this interesting like saying like, oh, like the one virtue he does like is modesty. I know Daniel's really big on that. Daniel had like this notion of modesty in Lacan, because we don't think like Lacan is a modest person per se with his personality. But you mentioned in the beginning of your response about this relationship with psychoanalysis and Cartesianism, and I think like I think this is like what I was saying. It was like like Freud kind of inverted it, but it was really Lacan to kind of explicitly say this, that psychoanalysis, the subject of psychoanalysis, is the subject of science. So I'm quoting from a really great thinker who I'm really I can say indebted to in my own project as a thinker, and Lorenzo Chiesa as well. Which, since you brought about agnosticism, I want to touch on that as well because of the new book, that he came out. I don't know if you're reading it, God is Undead, with Adrian, because that's like his position. But Lorenzo is also influenced by the same thinker as well. His name is Jean-Claude Milner. I've posted the text on my social media a lot because it's one that I'm working through on my own. But it's called "In Search for Clarity," and it has to do with science and philosophy in Lacan's thought. And yeah, like the subject that psychoanalysis works on is the subject of science, which is inaugurated by Descartes. But Descartes could only inaugurate the subject of science, the modern subject, because of the inauguration, the advent of modern science, right? And he gets his sort of grounds in science, that is Lacan, and this is Milner sort of reiterating, from two French thinkers, right? One is on this distinction between science of antiquity, or episteme, and modern science, from the ancient world to the modern world. So the first one is Alexander Koyré, who has this text on like the sort of I think it's called like infinite and finite worlds, but it's a text on this exact notion of the episteme of antiquity versus modern science, and then the distinction between the ancient world and the modern world from Alexander Kojev, the Hegelian, who would bring lectures on Hegel to Lacan and many other French philosophers at that time. And for Koyré, he says that the ancient episteme, alongside philosophy, really privileged theory and praxis, right? And they didn't have a sophisticated form of technology or techne or devices that really determined the effects and precisions of scientific experiments. Of course, you get like people like Aristotle that's dissecting, but like there's no like privilege of technology, and it's because most of the mathematics that they had were, it was Euclidean geometry based, right? And it's from Galileo, which Galileo's decentering of the Earth, of the geocentric model to not only a heliocentric one, but one that brings about this uncertainty because it's an infinite unfoldment, that we can't say that the sun has a telos on its own as well, because now we realize with this model that the universe is expanding, right? And it's not that he was also like the inventor of the telescope that was invented in the Netherlands, but he refined it because of the problem of refraction and optics that was very poor in science back then, and he was able to refine it to create a more precise observation of celestial movement. And so not only through the advent of modern science, but also the fact that now techne and episteme were built together, we have a split between the ancient world, because not only is episteme limited to only theory and praxis, we're also in a worldview of a cosmos that is heavenly put in order by logos, right? The real was that which was in harmony and through logos. Whereas now we have this sort of movement. We also have a conception of history that transitions from that period. This is not said by Correa, at least in my understanding. This is my kind of positing through Augustine, because Augustine was like the sort of first person to actually create a concept of time and history and an eschatology for Western philosophy, more Christianized form. But we have this sort of understanding as well, that there's like a sort of trajectory going somewhere, but it is now uncertain by the Galilean science, right? But what the Galilean science can do, insofar as it's a modern science, is develop devices and mathematical universes to be able to create precise forms of knowledge from this truth that there is a sort of mathematizable universe, right? And Descartes, as you said, fulfills, in a sense, this idea by able to prove God through math, because he's using mathematical formalism from modern science, right? Now, Alexander Kojev says that it is because of Christianity that we are able to break from the ancient world to have a more modern world to which modern science can exist as well. And so there's this link between Lacan, Kojev, and Koyré on this thesis of the difference between the two worlds. But the point that I was trying to make with this sort of long exegesis of the text is to show that, yes, there is, in a sense, not only a relationship to philosophy of the cogito, but also the subject of science and its inauguration with Lacan, that unfortunately Freud could not have expounded upon, because he was stuck within the limits of science and scientism. He was caught in trying to find an ideal science with the ideals of science. And Lacan is able to interrogate the subject of psychoanalysis, which is the Cartesian subject of science, because of knowledge versus truth. And so this is not truth with a capital T that we see in philosophy. It's actually the truth of the subject. And it is, I think, that is the truth of the cogito. That is the side of the split subject of enunciation versus what is enunciated. And so we could say, I think, right?
Mhm.
And it kind of goes along with like the other thing that he plays about with the liar's paradox of I am lying, right? Or this statement is false, the bottom statement is true, right? Uh, type logic, and he kind of sees a sort of similar uh, theme with the cogito. The truth of the cogito is, I think, anything after that is just what is enunciated and what is just forever metonymic. I think, therefore, I am, right? And it doesn't even have to be the I am. It could just be anything else after the truth of I think. The truth of the subject, which is also the truth of the unconscious, simply speaks, right? That is a sort of like radicality to the Cartesian subject. And I
Mhm.
think like in a way how this relates to everything that you were kind of responding about, up to the point of talking about something about the mystic, uh, it's always this constant retroactive back to the first truth of enunciation of I think, I speak, and then trying to conclude syllogistically with a bunch of metonymic chatter, which is symptomal of the unconscious. And we can never conclude succinctly because we're always going back to posit the initial truth that we posited, that we spoke, to make sure it was right. This is why the unconscious is not only just structured like a language, but also structured around a language whose logical movement is always an impetus. And this is how we can see the drive. The drive, in a sense, misses its object, but is always going back to uh, account for, and the subject, and so far it's propelled by the drive. It's going back to recount what it stated about itself, right? I think, therefore, for I am, nope, we're going back, right? Because it's the constitution of the subject of the lovely unconscious that speaks, that's trying to recount its past, recount its truth, right? The past as the truth, right? As it's being formulated in the present. And I think with this sort of uh I think with like this idea that you put about the purification, that we see in the level of the mystics, it's like, uh, I think it relates in a way where like, okay, so like it's this parallel between this whole thing that you posited about philosophy with like the uncertainty of knowing God, and also like this sort of uncertainty that we see in psychoanalysis of like, uh, will I be cured? Will I be fixed? Right?
Mhm.
And I think it's like not only a epistemic uh predicament, but also an ethical one, because
Mhm.
the unconscious is not an ontological substance. It's an ethical dimension, which involves not only the unconscious subject to make a choice regarding their desire and their aim, but also the analyst's intervention at the right moments to be able to speak and interpret. um I kind of see it as similar to like when in Sartre's and I'm not trying to make psychoanalysis and existentialism on the same thing, but I think this like sort of theme in Lacan of like forced choice or wagers,
Mhm.
Pascal come up with those Sartre say like to the students like my mother's sick, um and I want to take care of her, but I also want to join the war and serve my nation because my brother died in the war. Both are noble and ethical, choices, and you could say there's even a virtue to both of those, tending towards sick ones and especially your loved ones, or fighting for our nation's freedom. But it is a choice that we are condemned with, right? And in a sense, you're
Mhm.
always put in a choice to either be or think in psychoanalytic technique and in practice, and
Mhm.
in theory, because of the split subject, the one that always says "I think" is actually structured around either "I don't think" or "I am not." This question concerning thinking or being, right? And never being able to pick one at the right time, at the right place, at the right moment.
Mhm.
And it's a failed forced choice. Um, but yet, nevertheless, they make it right, and they have to have fidelity to it,
Right.
and in a way, fidelity to be able to continue to speak. And so like even though we put it positing the question concerning is there virtue, like, you know, is virtue compatible to psychoanalysis, I will say that it is a bit virtuous to be courageous and say I'm going to continue going through analysis because it's freaking tough. And you know, I feel like I'm not getting anything. I feel like I'm confused. I'm stuck in a rut with my own thoughts and my own contradictions, and yet I still endure and go through. And maybe like it doesn't feel as beautiful, and like I didn't come to like this voila epiphany moment, but something that is kind of so like it's almost relieving, or it's kind of just like bringing sort of like the what I feel is like the amalgamation of my own suffering to a level of like the mundane, where I'm like, huh, okay, it's not that bad after all. Like I you know, like Freud talks about like the only thing that one can hope for in psychoanalysis is ordinary and happiness, but I just think like maybe it's not even happiness, maybe it's just like ordinariness, right? And in a sense, like when you look at the mystics,
Mhm.
it's not like sort of platonic, gnostic, sublimity. Maybe that those things could happen, but that's not going to happen all the time. Maybe it's this ordinary mysticism where I have just this like relationship that's kind of just mundane, but also just transpersonal to me at the same time with God through prayer life, through different practices. Um, but before we get into that, I'll just say like with like you know this theme about like the forced choice, the wager. It's like this is what's going on. This is why he likes Pascal, because Pascal does bring something with regarding to also the problem of God as well, because it's centered around faith and belief, right? And this is why he's not a philosopher per se, or he's aligned with the gods of the philosophers, who guarantee a field of truth, and that I can know him to the right reason and deduction, because his wager provokes that God, whether God exists or not, can only come about through playing the game, and the subject who plays, you know, is evoked in the game, right? And God is not playing though, but God to whether or not God exists and whether I'm going to get infinite lives in the next life or infinite happiness versus hell. That's what's at stake, um, gain or loss.
Mhm.
And it's not that I gain something; it's like the possibility of gaining something, right? And from that, the belief of living a good life. And in a sense, what Lacan is saying is that like we wager our own jouissance and promise of knowledge when we enter an analysis, and it's not just me that's you know wagering, but it's also the other that's at stake, the big other that is the field of knowledge, or the other as the unfuckable partner, the woman that does not exist. And no matter how many relationships I'm in, I can never get that right woman, the one that's sublimated to the image of beauty, the beautiful woman, the courtly love, right? This impossible partner, because they do not exist. They are the other face of the big other, like God is the other face of the big other, the field of knowledge. And yet I wager this as my symptom, whether or not I believe I will get it or not. But I go through this process of free association. I go through this faith in the other. And also in psychoanalysis, what happens is that this big other that's provoked through the transference is related to what is provoked in the the discourse of science, which is the subject that's supposed to know, the subject that is absolute knowing, the subject that knows everything, right? So this is being traversed as well, not on the level as like, okay, we're subjects of science, so that means like we're entailing with science. No, we're actually like the symptomal effect of the subject of science as split between knowledge and truth. Truth of our symptom, and the field of knowledge that you know is sort of incomplete, right? And I think like to kind of I'll end my segment right here. Like I think that there is a sort of mystifying uh you know analogy, or an analogy of mysticism similar to this, where it's like God free me from God, you know, when you're able to handle your own desire and take responsibility. And it's not to say like, oh, be modest, but like, you know, when you develop a sense of modesty because you realize your own excess, your own symptom,
Mhm.
how your desire fucks you over, and you're able to scansion it, and you're able to speak about it, to speak your desire, just like you're able to speak your desire for God in prayer, you start to develop this sort of practice, right?
Right. So I want to address the first thing about shame. So there's this, because I've noticed there's like this really weird like moral collapse that people do with shame, which is super interesting because I found in Aristotle, he kind of pointed it out to me, which is, so he makes a distinction between when you do something unjust, you can do an unjust act. But then there is the, what he calls injustice, right? There is like, there's like this actual point of injustice, but then there is the unjust act. And the unjust act doesn't necessarily imply that it is unjust, because what it takes for it to be unjust is actually a conscious decision. It's actually like the knowledge, you knew what you were doing. So when I think back to like the forced choice, it's kind of like it's really just like it's a toss up. I mean, but it's like you don't really know, right? Like this is what's interesting about virtue as mean, is that there is, it's not like, it's not a straightforward formula. You know, it's like it requires so much for you to know and be aware of. But to circle back on shame, and what I mean by this is like, what I notice is that people experience shame and they say I did something wrong. For example, if I get angry, I know psychoanalysis would be sympathetic to this, I believe. Just like if I get angry and I do something out of my anger, Aristotle would say you weren't a voluntary agent in that process. Because you did not sit back and deliberate about what you were going to do when you acted out of anger. But what's interesting is, and this is the part that Aristotle doesn't elaborate on, is that nowadays we have this, and I think it is because of the superego, actually. It's because you do something that wasn't literally your voluntary deliberation, your conscious choice to do, that you go, okay, well then I'm just a horrible person. And then so you have to deal with that shame. And I feel like a lot of psychoanalysis is just trying to untangle that knot between an unjust act, which is, I did something that I normally wouldn't do or I wouldn't do. But also at the same time, it was my anxiety, my guilt, my shame, my anger, my sadness, whatever it was. But that for Aristotle doesn't count as anything. Doesn't count for anything. It actually shows a less degree of responsibility. So that's like one little thing right there I wanted to just like bring out, because I feel like that was important to address. Now I'm gonna have to like go into this concept of beauty, because now I feel like it's time to go into it, which is the way Daniel Luber and Jockin describe beauty is this more like glimmer objective strike that happens to the subject. And what happens is that the subject then realizes out of this surprise that they must change their life. So it is something quite analogous to the wager. A bit. Beauty forces you to respond to this command, but it's definitely not something within the field of your knowledge. But it's this idea that you must change your life, this kind of desire. So it's a surprise, a glimmer, a strike of beauty. it has very little to do. I mean, it could, but I would say it has very little to do with like these aesthetic qualities of like, oh wow, that's so beautiful. It's like actually maybe perhaps more has to do with all, which is it could be awesome or it could be awful, depending on how you prepare for that very strike itself. So I think, like, for example, if you were to make like the wager, that would be horrible for a lot of people. If they weren't able to prepare themselves, and this Daniel makes a distinction between preparing and planning, right? So like, how do you prepare for a surprise? Well, that's kind of hard because you can't really like plan for it, but you could prepare for it, which is to kind of put you in this kind of mode of being in which you could be possibly receptive to the surprise, even though you have no idea what the surprise is itself. So I think beauty can either take you on this path of like, you know, you're wagering your jouissance, like you're saying, like take you like straight to the dark night of the soul kind of thing. Or you know, it could take you somewhere else, which is this, you know, higher receptivity. But I think for the most part, at this point, everyone would have to go through the kind of dark night of the soul. So this splitting, there's other things here. Okay, so the other thing is, and I'm kind of like going from a bunch of different angles here, is that there's also this other problem of this idea of nous. Nous is what Aristotle, you know, what translator would call like thinking, you know. Well, Thomas Jockin, my buddy, he has a big, really big problem with the way people talk about thinking and the modern subject, because he feels like they just all they collapsed all the different relations of nous that existed. And I've been trying to talk with him, like, what are the possible relations between the unconscious and conscious and in relation to nous and everything else. And he was saying, well, the human being has a passive nous, but the human being also has an intellectual nous. Now, I feel like my framing of this could be wrong, but I feel like what is the unconscious for the subject is actually the passive nous. Then psychoanalysis does what it does because it has to untangle the knots because of the subject's intellectual nous that they've sort of obfuscated and are being an obstacle to this very passive nous, because it's actually the passive nous that's coming out from the subject. But then there is the nous in toto, the nous that's outside of man himself, which Jockin would quote me that for Aristotle, actually nous is God, basically. Yeah. Go ahead.
I would actually flip it around. I would say that the unconscious is more like the last nous that you're talking about, God, than it is the passive. And by qualification, because of, not that I'm saying like there is God, although we hear in Lacanians talk about like God being the big other, but that the unconscious is the discourse of the other, right? And it is not very passive at all. It is actually very active in its own way through the way that the signifier, because the unconscious is structured like a language, this discourse, which is different from, let's say, speech or parole. But in Lacan's use of parole, the breakdown, the mumbling, the slips of the tongue that come from Freud, the parapraxis, these are in which the unconscious discourse of the other manifest from the gaps of speech, right? Now, I don't know if like it would be correct to map out those three nooses succinctly, because I don't think, necessarily like, Aristotle's noose, no matter how much you break it down and accurately attain it, would be all that analogous or homologous to the Freudian and Lacanian subject.
Yeah.
But I do think in the way that you kind of explained that, I will say that when what exactly is passive about the passive aspect of the noose? Other
So
than that it's not active.
so it's more about like the way I can explain it is only like in a kind of like theological like relation, right? So the way that Jock can kind of relate to me, and he might kill me for slaughtering this. So the intellectual noose is more about a lot of the agent's sort of faculties, the memory and everything like that. But then there's the passive noose. The passive noose is generally what's going to be receptive to these things. Now, of course, this is where the asymmetrical kind of relation happens, because I feel like actually what is the unconscious, quote, quote, I would kind of redo this interpretation, would actually say the unconscious is this very relation between noose and man's passive noose. Precisely because if it is this kind of discourse, like a discourse, which is funny because it's like an analogy, then in the theological reference, the passive noose is basically man's essence in itself that you cannot capture.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but it's man's essence in itself precisely because it's connected to the nous in toto, the nous its own essence.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that in a theological kind of metaphor, right, the state of a man's soul, his essence, when it goes through a kind of malady, it starts acting out.
Mm-hmm.
So that means it acts out through the intellectual nous, through our behavior, through the way we remember, through the way that we talk, through the way that we act. So I feel like, I mean, of course, it's crazy to be mapping this onto this. It's for me, it could be quite analogous to say that the unconscious is actually the very relation between man's own essence of himself that cannot be captured and itself as an essence that cannot be captured. And it's precisely this relation between these two that I would probably say is the unconscious. And then the intellectual nous is probably what we call just man's thinking. So yeah, I said a lot there on that.
No. And I'm listening. Like, I wish I had a thicker Sharpie. Can you see this? Or is it blurred?
Yeah, I can see that if you put it like that. Like
yeah.
that.
So this is the master's discourse, right?
Okay.
Up top you have an S1, right? The signifier is what represents the subject for another signifier, S2. Okay. And what we have is loss, the little a, the object, cause of desire. Now this is also the discourse that exemplifies the unconscious for two reasons, because what the signifier does is represent the barred subject that is absent in the equation, but also the truth condition for this discourse to be possible, even in science. And the discourse and Lacan's notion of discourse is the realist because it aims towards its own impossibility. Structure, I should say, the structure of discourse is real because it aims towards its own impossibility, and also the fact that it also reverts to its cause as well, the effect trying to find its cause. So it is the split subject, this subject of science, who is foreclosed from its own discourse. This signifier, whatever this concept is, addresses this field of knowledge. S2 just means that it is a second. So S1 and S2 does not mean that this is the very first signifier. This is the very second signifier. No, this means that we have impassive formalization 1 and impassive formalization 2. This meaning that a signifier that has the impossibility to represent this, and also the impossibility to be completed, right? And so this is what A means, that there's always something left out. A is always left out. And what moves this impossibility is that what we have right here is the formula for fantasy. This formula for fantasy that for me to be completed by the big other, I am moved by jouissance. I am moved by the surplus that remains in my unconscious, that one day I will be complete and I will be one with the other, or one like the other, right? So this is what the unconscious is doing. And I guess why I showed that is to show that, like, no matter what, like for science or for philosophy, it's orbiting around oneness, or a conflation with being, and the one as one and the same. And I know Badiou has a lot to say about that in the subject, and what was the other one? Being an event. But I think right there, it's like what's the mechanisms happening at the level of the unconscious, are the repetition of a count, right, somewhere, to try to count all these different signifiers that represent the subject for another signifier, to complete the other, and then to repeat. Now, this is just all topological. This has nothing to, this is not us talking about a specific, like, patient, but this is the sort of topology that Lacan uses to address what is unconscious. Because for him, the unconscious is not just structured like language, but it is one that has to revert back to mathematical logic to understand impasses at the side of formalization. And maybe this does not get at what you were explaining and elaborating about nous and its passive nous and active nous. But I think, like, what is operating at the level of the unconscious for Lacan is all too active. It just is impossible because it's two impossible relations. And this is why it's analogous to the Russell set, right? Because the Russell set, which tries to be the set to contain all sets, right? Sets only contain members, elements, or variables that do not represent or contain themselves. And so if a set is trying to contain all sets that do not contain themselves, well, it's an impossible function, and also fails to meet the criteria of its own definition. And so for the signifier, right, the signifier by definition needs another signifier to get its meaning, right? But then at the same time, the signifier for Lacan is also trying to represent the subject. So the signifier ultimately fails because, one, it can never get its full meaning from every other signifier, because, well, when's the last one? What is the last one, right? So that's why that other signifier, that one, tries to be the intervention to be the last one, right? But it's also impossible because it also has to represent that subject that's not there, right? The subject of science. So we're dealing with two impossibilities that not only exemplify what's going on at the level of the unconscious topologically, but also a topology of the structure of knowledge, of all these various forms of knowledges in science and philosophy that are trying to do. So it's like we have to deal with the subject, and a subject that both of you and I are thinking about, that is aligned with the psychoanalytic subject and the philosophical subject, whose inquiry is ethical virtue, right? So I think it's like, at this level of impossibility, is it a forced choice of arete, or is virtue something which aligns with beauty and the good, something that changes our lives? That and here's why, like, I guess, like, even though you explain it, like, I don't know if beauty is necessarily the thing that, for psychoanalysis at least, is going to force me to change. Ultimately, it's my own desperation and the inability to fix myself, or thinking that, oh, the analyst is a subject supposed to know, who's got all the answers and everything for my cure, my desire. So I mean, I don't know. Like, I think, like,
so this is gonna be like on the nose a little bit, but like, it's very clear that psychoanalysis is concerned with some type of ethics. But then
absolutely.
Absolutely. But then it gets really ambiguous as to where it comes from on that. Like, why? Like for me, this is where I'm like, I think Julie Resch wins only because of this very cynical question, which is, why does psychoanalysis care? What drives psychoanalysis itself in terms of its ethical formation to care about a subject's own unconscious and drive them to a state of normalcy, perhaps, if that is even possible, right? Like, to me, that is the big philosophical press point. Like, what? Yeah.
Yeah, well, so I think like when you look at the structural topology that Lacan lays out with the discourses, I think it's because ultimately there's this gap that in again knowledge, this hole that creates subjects, and so like that impossibility not only is it the one that laid out is the master's discourse, it's the also what happens at the level of the unconscious, but then you have ways to try to work around this impetus, and you know in seminar 17 he talks about the shift or the quarter churn of these discourses. So then you've got the university discourse, and we shouldn't look at these things as historical because we're not going to be able to locate these things in history. This is not a historicism like, oh, in ancient Greece they had the master's discourse, and then and like now we have the university, and then like there's in Lacan's time with May 68 because he called those protesters hysterics. That's the hysterics discourse, and we live at the time. No, like it's not like this weird like sort of like different zeitgeists of discourse theory. It's a real structure looking at knowledge and truth and the subject's relationship to it, and ultimately the subject's relationship to jouissance, which is the other side of knowledge. And I think insofar as that, like, the university discourse is knowledge trying to address the hole in the other, but fails, only creates alienated subjects, right, that are actually still divorced from the operation that we get, well, from the master, really, the master's discourse, we get this, but I feel like it's furthered from the university in a different way. From the master's discourse, we get the hysteric who questions, who puts into question the subject supposed to know. But it's because that the master's discourse is also concealed and is tried to get this patchwork done by the university discourse, that the university discourse is allowed to get a quarter turn to create psychoanalysis, right? All that jargon aside, what I'm saying is that insofar as that, like, there's always a hole in this question of care, there's also a hysteric who puts that into question, and hysteric in that sense, and not just like the all forever questioner, like a Socrates type who questions everything but knows nothing, but that we have the demand, right? The demand for love, the demand of the cure. And the very first psychoanalytic patient is also the founder of psychoanalysis, to which Freud and Bruno and Joseph Breuer. That was an interesting slip. I was about to say Joseph Breuer, but I said Bruno, like as I was going to say Bruno Bauer, which is one of the young Hegelians. But yeah, like there is always this sort of demand for the subject supposed to know's knowledge, and to always expose the holes in the master. But then the analyst that comes and arrives because of the insistent demand, that the analyst listens and something acts like a sort of chance event, right? And this is why, like, Lacan will liken like the transference as a chance encounter with 2K and repetition. So repetition shouldn't always necessarily be automaton, like this sort of endless determinism that like has no interruption or control. But rather on the side of 2K, 2K is what repeats by chance, right? And so it's something structural that happens. Is this chance through the hysterics demands, and then also the analyst that arrives from there to interpret and relay the message back in an inverted form. And so it's like, why, like, for the Reich questions, like why do analysts care so much? What is the ethical dimension? And maybe doesn't really answer it that much, but it's like insofar as that desire, right, is also questioning the analyst desire. What does the analyst also desire in this aspect?
Mhm.
Also because, and it's not every analysan that when they finally are cured that they become analysts, but some, if a majority, if not a majority, some become analysts after they go through their full process of being under the couch, or being under analysis line on the couch. That they become analysts themselves. Some don't. Some, like, for instance, Lacan analyzed one of Picasso's ex-lovers, and she became very spiritual, like almost like a Christian mystic. So that's really interesting as well. So maybe there is some strange relationship to Christian mysticism
Mhm.
and the prolonged effects of psychoanalytic talking cure. But I think really to answer like that, and again, I don't know if this is just like a sort of vague statement, but it's like it's really the sort of ambiguities of the questions concerning desire. I'll say that again, the ambiguities of the questions concerning desire, not of desire itself, but of the questions that arise from desire, right? Am I
Uh-huh.
a man or a woman? Am I living or am I dead? Right? Am I someone that's capable of doing X, Y, and Z in society? Especially if, like, when I am talking about the society I live in my analysis, I'm talking about the contradictions, my ambivalences, my resentments towards this and that people. And yet at the same time, I still want to be someone that has a proper place in, I desire to have a proper place in such society that I constantly express resignment and abandonment and even contentment towards, right?
Mhm.
And so these are the sort of ambiguous questions that come up.
So I don't know if psychoanalysis makes a distinction between motivation and desire.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because like
Yeah.
in because like in
Oh,
our
no, no, go ahead.
yeah, because in our understanding, motivation, like, so my buddy told me, it's like motivation would be, because desire is so fickle, right? It can always change. And I feel like this is why, like, I feel like psychoanalysis resistance to like something like ethics is just like sort of odd to me. Only in the sense of, like, because I feel like all psychoanalysis is really trying to say, and this is a very crude reduction, but like it's just really like you're a subject that lacks and you're a subject that doesn't know really what they desire. Um, and so you're constantly gonna undermine yourself in a kind of way. But then psychoanalysis itself has this strange, like, when does psychoanalysis fall into its own self-irony? And how is it possible that it can critique itself within its own limitations, precisely because seems to be the very thing that it avoids, like a hysterical question?
No, that's a good point, because, like, I think this is going back to the, so one, it's like the analyst desire. What is it that the analyst is desiring to do? Why do they maintain being an analyst, right? Because one could criticize that, like, we just end up having like a sort of new caste of priests that hide in secrecy and just have these patients that are under their treatment, but like, what is happening? What are they doing? Are they just like this sort of people that live in this liminal space of the contradictions of society? And, like, for me, I think Alenka points this out because in her What is Sex book, it's actually not her, she actually is quoting another person. She's quoting Louis Althusser, the
Mhm.
French Marxist, the godfather of the theory of ideology.
Mhm.
But he talks about how, like, Marxism and psychoanalysis are very similar because they're they're not separate from their own object of inquiry, and also take themselves in account as, like, in the sense that their symptoms, they're symptomal sciences. They're not sciences on their own, although for him, he would like Marxism to have a sort of authentic relationship to a science that's not caught in ideology. Um, but like in the sense that like it's an effect of science, in a sense like the effect of the failures of uncertainty that come with modern science, and its failed promises. It's actually more embedded in superstition than it would like to say. And then also the failures of and this is the Marxist side, of bourgeois society and the political economy and all that stuff. But like to focus on the psychoanalytic portion, not to get lost in the tangent, I think it's like the theory and even the context to which psychoanalysis is surrounded by must be taken into account to avoid falling into like its own irony, because it is always taking itself into account, because it's not the funny thing is it's like it doesn't proclaim to have a body of knowledge, right? So that's the interesting thing, but yet it is a practice, and it puts into question the sort of the gaps and inconsistencies of, again, the structures of knowledge, and that's including both philosophy and science, but also, and this is credit to Freud, that the subjects, the patients that are being worked on, are bringing in not only something singular to them, like something personal when it comes to their traumatic experience, but also they're bringing in all the interpolations of society, right?
Right.
Because where do we learn all our customs, our norms, our ways to interact with society, whether if they're perfect or not, or they're failed or assimilated, is through the family, right? The family is the nucleus of society, whether we're talking about in psychoanalysis or we're talking about in Marxism with the production and social reproduction of labor and private property, but through the family. And for psychoanalysis, this is where the Oedipus complex comes in, because the law is instantiated, right? You need to separate from your mother. It is time to grow up. And then you have to rival ambivalently with your father. Very colloquial, very stereotypical. But it shows that like what is happening is that a subject is being created from the instantiation of the law, the prohibition, um, and then to assimilate how to desire and the object that is worthy of desire and worthy of being loved. And of course, that never works. That fails because the family is not a perfect cellular organization. It is flawed, not only psychoanalytically speaking, because of what Freud's discoveries regarding Oedipus, infantile sexuality, and family dynamics, rivalry, etc. But even in the Marxist sense as well, and we even talk about how what the Oedipus would look like, Oedipus complex would look like in broken families, because that's where you see like people whether they live in like youth homes because they don't have families, they were abandoned, or they live with single mothers or single fathers. They're going to reach out to some sort of group identification with whether it's on the internet, whether it's in these sort of political groups that are predatory towards the alienated, disenfranchised youth. Incel groups, etc., are a perfect example of the way that the incel group reaches out via social media to influence disenfranchised and alienated young men to thinking that women are the problem. And the way that Christopher Lasch, he talks about how the culture of narcissism, how because of the failure of the families, children and teens are reaching out to the institutions of the market to be able to have some sort of identification, because narcissism in a Freudian Lacanian sense is not like this sort of grandiose, like, oh, I'm just a self-contained grandiose person, I only care about myself. But actually no, it's a traumatic wound. It is like a way to patch up myself to prevent a world from collapsing, right? I need to have some sort of stability. Freud in his narcissism essay kind of calls it a sort of like a metaphor of the hypochondria. It's an illness that I have to address right? But I address in these like tactics that never work out perfectly. So in a sense, it's like, in that long-winded tangent, it's like to this point that I think you brought about, so long as we're like in again this complexity of social relations that don't work out and these social bonds that are constantly failing, psychoanalysis will be there, especially if we are still dealing with subjects that are also split subjects, right?
Right.
So long as we're speaking beings that are speaking out um, symptoms that are social, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it maybe even goes back to like another point about like the thing in Aristotle about the act, and you were talking about justice and injustice, and what was the term again? It was like sort of the not accountable act. What was it?
I'm just that.
So there was like you were talking about justice and injustice, but it was a specific word about having like a agency of the act or
Oh, it would be involuntary, voluntary.
involuntary, involuntary. In a sense, like psychoanalysis, you could see take on this quite succinctly with the fact that, like, when you look at the myth of the totem and taboo, the killing of the primal father, this is where the tyranny of the father was finally ended by the brotherhood, and they realized themselves as brothers, and they vowed to never do what the father did, and they were able to create a civilization. But the problem is like now we are a civilization that's carrying around this super egoic guilt, a guilt of a crime that we haven't committed, but we have a guilt as if we committed the crime. Um, and another way to kind of like illustrate this, like I think Alenka talks about this in the ethics of the real with Jacques-Alain Miller talking about like this guilt and being condemned that this patient has because it's like they're not free enough, or even if they are feel free in certain moments and act, it's like it's never enough. So like no matter how voluntary they try to act, it always ends up in feeling guilty because they could have done more, they didn't do enough. um that I kind of paraphrased that, but like the another point that I could bring up is like actually in Lacan, I think it's seminar one or seminar two, but my buddy Nick likes this line, but it's like the this patient of Lacan, who came from a Islamic background, who grew up in the Arabic culture and was raised Muslim, and they as they got older they became atheists, they became secular, they disowned their affiliation towards Islam, to a more sort of modern cosmopolitan way of living, and they were neurotic, I guess, from the description of Lacan, and they just would always talk about these random pains in their hands. Well, there was a recount of the time in which, so in the culture that he was raised, if one was publicly seen or accused of theft, then they would get their hand cut off, right? And it was supposed that his father was accused of such crime, and so he witnessed the hand of his father being cut off. And so, even though he does not assimilate with that culture, with with those beliefs, and lives in a more Parisian society, uh, that the law still remains, and he is uh, guilty, and the superego makes him feel guilty in the form of the hand pain for misrecognizing the law every time he acts. So it's not even, you could say about the involuntary or voluntary, but that you end up feeling shame or guilty because you misrecognize the law in which you act involuntarily or voluntarily, right? So it's the law uh that is constantly misrecognized, and it's misrecognized not only by the superego but by the subject of the unconscious, who is constantly being bombarded by the superego's imperative to act right, to enjoy right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
It it's interesting because it's like yeah, you can misrecognize a law. Aristotle kind of talks about this, but like in a different way. But like you can forget a transaction that happened between you and someone, and then an injustice can occur because somebody forgot about the reality of a transaction, and so you could suffer the consequences of this. So for Aristotle, there's different senses of justice, and there's this other element of justice, which is it's called active justice, which is a more to alleviate the wrong or the misunderstanding or rectify. So it has to do more with rectification. But so this is what I want to ask, because I feel like this blank space that you talk about, this gap, this gap where psychoanalysis seems to, the way you, correct me if I'm wrong, so the way you frame psychoanalysis is a responsive thing to the failures of a modern society, if you just say for right now, the modern subject, the way social bonds, laws, etc., affect the subject, and the failure that occurs. And so psychoanalysis seems to be the very response to this thing. And for me, again, it's like, I know I'm kind of doing the hysterical questioning of like, why is it that psychoanalysis is so motivated towards this response? Because I feel like that very gap for psychoanalysis is the very symptomatic fear of them proposing an ethics. Because
Yeah. No, these is really good, and maybe it's just like, it is a sort of psychoanalytic repetition of asking this so we could come to a truth, because it's not about knowledge, it's about truth, right?
Okay.
And truth is not in the Platonic sense. I think the best way to understand it would be truth the Baduian sense of that there is an effect from a procedure, right? And something of novelty comes up. And maybe it is regarding ethics. Like I wouldn't still go so far as to say that psychoanalysis does not have an ethical system, or to be exact, psychoanalysis is not without not without the ethical, right? And insofar, and that's apophatic, right? Not without the ethical. Insofar as that, if the unconscious is sort of subjugated by the law of desire, right? Whether it's misrecognized or not, acted involuntarily, it's like something that needs to be demystified, right? To get somebody to be able to take responsibility of their own symptom, of their own suffering. And I think the key things that you just stated, which I've been trying to talk about, is the fact that it's the effect of modern science and its effect of modern bourgeois, and even we could say still persists because of late stage capitalism. And I'll just put it like this: Lacan in Seminar 3 gives a really good, it's in chapter 10. It's one of my favorite chapters. And I've written about it on my Substack. It was more of like an exegesis of commentary. But Seminar 3 is all about psychosis. And one of the things about the famous psychotic patient Schreber, Daniel Paul Schreber, who was a judge, he wrote this memoirs called Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, in which he talks about religious experiences, God communicating with him being God's lover, and God will marry him so he could restore the world, and that God doesn't communicate with him through revelation, like in words, but through this sort of nerve language, to where his soul is connected with nerves of his body and extensions of God, and these little souls like communicate with him. It's bonkers. But in this 10th lesson, chapter 10, Lacan talks about like how the psychotic and the neurotic are martyrs of the unconscious, and he uses the term martyrs in the original sense of being a witness to something, like the original Christians were martyrs, but also martyrs in the sense that they were witness to their own suffering and persecution, to adhering to the being a witness of Christ, right? So in a sense, both the neurotic and the psychotic are martyrs, not only to their own suffering, but you could say of being a witness to the ongoing suffering and delusion of society. And the difference is that the neurotic speaks about their martyrdom in a cryptic form of dream formations, of parapraxis, of slips of the tongue, of metaphors and metonymy, substitution and displacement of the signifier in Freud. But for the psychotic, it's like they don't have the ability to speak in a coherent discourse. It's always incoherent, inconsistent. The best way to think about it is the Dark Knight. When Joker comes up to everybody's like, you want to know how I got these scars? And the first time it's like, my dad used to beat my mom, and he would look at me, and then he came up with a knife and he's like, you need to smile more. Or no, it was like he says, why so serious? And that's the first one. And the second one, he says something slightly different. And then the third one, he's talking to Rachel. It's like, yeah, you remind me of my wife. My wife said I need to smile more. And so I grabbed a razor and I went like this. And there she goes. Now she can't stand the smile on my face. So maybe I understand the bright side to it all, right? So this inconsistency of a narrative of how he got these scars, right? It's never the same. This is something that you could see similar to psychotics when they talk about their own sort of delusions or hallucinations regarding the effects of their martyrdom. But what does that have to do with what I'm saying about this whole thing about the modern society? Well, Lacan gives this analogy or this homology, what he calls about the discourse of servitude and liberation versus the discourse of freedom. And he says that we could think of the discourse of liberation as a sort of secret, unconscious thing that happens in societies where slavery existed. Or we could think about the discourse of liberation from the master-slave dialectic, to which the servitude of the bondsman revolts, and then is able to liberate themselves. And of course, he's using the Hegelian dialectic in the background of the French Revolution and its history. And so we end up not only in a society that's liberated, but we now enter in something called the discourse of freedom. We live in a free society, but nobody could say what that means. In essence, everything that we predicate on freedom is the exact opposite in impetus of freedom. Freedom of the market, freedom of property, freedom of certain relations, economic or political, but they don't really illustrate what freedom is, right? So we're caught into this sort of resigned abandonment, because nobody, even though they operate on this idea that they're free, are rather only acting individually. So when they are encountered by the other with questions regarding things that would predicate on freedom, and he gives this example of when somebody consoles somebody of whether or not they should get married, they don't say yes or no, not because they don't want to reveal their like hidden intentions or hidden opinion, like, oh no, I secretly don't think this person is even worthy of being married. No, they're a freaking idiot. No, it's the fact that it puts us on the position to knowing exactly what freedom is, and to be able to speak of not only my own freedom, but the freedom of others. This question of knowing what the other is based upon me knowing what freedom is. And that is the problem of modern society in Lacan's eyes, of what is called the discourse of freedom. And so in order to keep that at bay, we live in a shared delusion. We live in a delusion that we're all free, right? In the discourse of servitude, it's the negation of of what's really going on, a discourse of slavery, a discourse of mastery, right? So the contrary to slavery is liberation, right? But now we are in a free society, but we do everything that can't be defined as free, and in fact we feel more unfree. So like we don't have a contrary to freedom. It wouldn't be liberation. Why would we liberate ourselves from freedom, right? That wouldn't make sense. But yet, even in the sight of freedom, we feel so unfree. So this is a problem of society and a problem of discourse, and where this antagonistic tension is where psychoanalysis situates itself, because this is suffering. This is a side of suffering. We're so free that we're unfree, and yet how do we liberate ourselves? Because it's so nonsensical. Why would we liberate ourselves from freedom? We liberate ourselves from slavery or servitude or bondage. And so, well, Lacan is getting at in Seminar 3 is to show that from this effect of modern liberal society, and he's talking about French society because of the political history of the French Revolution. We could apply that even today with like America and the tradition of American Revolution up till now, and sort of mercantile or no a meritocratic capitalism where everybody needs to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. So why would we need to be liberated from that? Everybody's free to do whatever they want, but no, we're unfree, and yet we don't have the language to say why. And so psychoanalysis is always on the effect of expressions of unfreedom, right? Of constant suffering. And so long as that exists, in my opinion, psychoanalysis uh, will continue to persist because of the suffering of I am unfree and all these other things. Yeah, that was a lot. I hope that makes sense, though.
No, I mean like so I mean yeah, I mean I agree. Like psychoanalysis has an ethics.
Yeah. And I don't, yeah, like, and I said this, like, I don't want to leave this conversation, like, maybe this is a two-parter, but I don't want to, like, leave this conversation saying, like, there's an aporia. We'll never know if there's an ethics in psychoanalysis. I think it's really, insofar as we ascertain truth in psychoanalysis, that maybe we get something like, is there a specific ethics? Is it deontology? Is it virtue, right? Is it, an Epicurean? And I have
Well,
to say, so long as like this, okay, I was going to say, so long as desire and truth are kind of talked about, with this subject.
okay, so this is where we can begin.
Mhm.
Because I think a lot of what so this is definitely like this is like a just beginning conversation, right? Because I know realistically, and I knew this coming in. I knew realistically, like this is going to be like there's no way we're going to solve this today. The next time we talk, there's no way. But I want to draw out exactly where psychoanalysis is concerned, to draw out exactly why it has this. Basically, if there is to be an ethics, obviously it has to do with what is psychoanalysis concerned about. And whatever psychoanalysis is concerned about is a possibility in which an ethics could possibly emerge. So I'm going to just kind of go through some stuff, kind of like recap, and you can add more. I'm kind of just going to make a list here, and then we can, later on, we can end this talk or summarize, and we can continue the conversation over time about what could possibly happen from this. So one is, I'm going to just talk about concerns. So psychoanalysis, you said, is concerned with this idea of freedom and unfreedom. Truth, but to demystify truth. And then they have this other thing about, I had it at the tip of my tongue now, suffering. They're concerned about suffering. That's an ethical thing. So freedom, unfreedom, demystifying truth. That's also an ethical thing. Suffering. The fourth one, I'll just say like polis kind of concerns. Social, yeah, polis, social constitution. That may be more, yeah. I'll put that in there.
Yeah, I like how you said freedom, unfreedom, because one of the things that, like, is a big Lacanian trope is that Lacan says specifically, I never concern myself with freedom, or I never talk about freedom, or psychoanalysis is not in the business of granting freedom. And I think it's just because of like the political milieu that he's living in. When you have like all sorts of fields of French theory, including the sort of disillusionment that people had against the French Communist Party, the PCF, during that time, and it's sort of like adherence to the state and the status quo. And so, like, you get a lot of people talking about freedom, yet like this new wave of French Hegelianism, the Sino-Soviet split to where a lot of Marxists are sort of like disillusioned. You get existential phenomenology from Sartre to Beauvoir to Merleau-Ponty, where they talk about freedom. And Lacan is not in that business of freedom, especially because people are also trying to like, oh God, like Lacan is popular. He's hot shit right now. What does he have to say about freedom? Or what does psychoanalysis have to say about phenomenology and philosophy? They're one and the same thing, especially Merleau-Ponty was like, psychoanalysis and philosophy are in the same business. And this is in seminar two. He gave a talk on philosophy and psychoanalysis. So philosophy and psychoanalysis are both humanisms because they aim at understanding. And Lacan says, no, that is not the case. Why? Well, because one, we never can understand. We either understand too late or too soon. And that it cannot be a humanism because of the death drive. The death drive, not only as, like my modus operandi to keep me and allied my aim, right? Because when we're talking about ethics, it's not just about the object of inquiry, it's rather the aim, and that's specific for Lacan. And I would say, like, for Aristotle, aim was like the primacy of ethics, right? It's about the aim. Of course, we were aiming at the good life, but it's the aim. And so there's a lot of affinity. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of affinity with Lacan and Aristotle. He's talking about Aristotle from seminar one all the way to this very last seminar. Aristotle's huge in a lot of the later seminars. But because of the death drive, it cannot be a humanism. And also because the death drive, which is related to the unconscious, is also a decentering movement conceptually, which decenters man from being the master of his own house, of his own abode. And so I think now that we're like at a different time, we could think of psychoanalysis regarding ethics. I mean, even a lot of these like radically left and progressive psychoanalysts that are in all these different cartels will be like, okay, we need to decolonize psychoanalysis. It's a good thing, and I'm a Marxist and I'm about that, but the sort of insistence to like, we need to decolonize, but you're prescribing an uncritical, unacknowledged modus operandi or ethical imperative to psychoanalytic practice that you're just assuming would go right. And it's not to say again, like, the political importance of decolonization is bad. It's a good thing. We need that, of course. We need that as a whole, as politically and philosophically, of course. But like that whole idea kind of doesn't really elucidate the necessity for that. Like, what is being enunciated by the level of these uncritical psychoanalysts, in my opinion. This is my own polemic, by the way, but I think it's the fact that it's like, well, they're not addressing the ethical dimension, because I think, again, this is not a sort of like, okay, we'll solve the ethical problem tonight, right? It will take, because if we could solve the ethical problem of psychoanalysis, maybe we also have to account for that. We have to solve the problem of ethics and philosophy in general, right?
Right.
It's not just a psychoanalytic problem, it's a philosophical problem as well.
Mhm.
And so, like, I think with like this whole like demand to decolonize, the demand to be a non-patriarchal, be against white supremacy. It's like, who are these white supremacist psychoanalysts? They don't exist anywhere. Like, I've never seen any, cishet white supremacist Eurocentric psychoanalysts. Like, show me. It's like Zizek when he's telling Jordan Peterson, where are these postmodern neoliberal progressive Marxists at? Tell me where one of them. And so, like, what I'm trying to get at, like, is just to show, like, even like the ethical is uncritically and unconsciously provoked in psychoanalytic circles in the guise of political action.
Mhm.
And so it's like, again, what does that mean? And like, you listed what I said, like the freedom and unfreedom thing, demystifying truth, which I actually like that. That's actually an interesting way to use that verbiage, paraphrase, demystifying truth. And then the last thing had to do with the problems of modern society, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
yeah, and I guess like it's so interesting because like with this demystifying truth thing, I think it just shows it's like really what is meant by truth is like also for psychoanalysis can be easily stated as like just the acknowledgement via the subject of the human condition as a symptom, but it's like a modern symptom. It's not to say that this is an invariance throughout all human history, right? Because psychoanalysis, of course, didn't exist back in ancient Greek society or ancient India, or ancient Africa and Egypt, in Communion society. No, this is a modern thing. The subject is a modern phenomenon, and it's something that can only be realized at this certain conjuncture, as a sort of a structural conjuncture to which there is an effect via knowledge that is able to create psychoanalysis, and at the same time pose into question, I guess, the not only just truth but the ethical paradigm. And I kept on saying desire, but also maybe we should go back to jouissance, the drive, because of this excess thing that happens, that where jouissance not only takes the form of just me undermining myself and my suffering. Oh yeah, suffering was a thing that you mentioned, and you're like, yeah, that's an ethical concern, and it is because jouissance is not enjoyment
Right.
necessarily. Jouissance is suffering, right?
Right.
And it's the suffering that I have to, because of the pleasure principle, I have to keep at abeyance, but also try to maintain homeostasis in the Freudian sense. But
Right.
in doing so, I make myself suffer more, right? So it's kind of like understanding why is it that my jouissance, and not just, you know, jouissance as enjoyment and suffering simultaneously, but as a sort of configuration, as a sort of network, a circuit, right? And of course, it's not without society's symbolic order imposing itself onto me, but in the fact that in so doing so, it also fails to do so. Mladen Dolar has this text called Failed Interpolation, where it's like subjects are not interpolated subjects, but rather like the effect of failed interpolation. And it's
Mhm.
because of that that like I am, jouissance is what is sort of rejected out of society. It's abject. So I am a jouissance being because I am abjected out of society. The paradox is that I am both entering the society, but also abjected out, because not all of society symbolic order is able to represent all of me as a speaking libidinal being.
Right.
And so this becomes a problem where psychoanalysis is able to apprehend that no other science can. And insofar as I can enjoy, and I continuously suffer because of my inability to enjoy to the fullest, and that these have consequences, that I'm able to come to uh, reconcile that in the clinic. And with suffering, yeah, it is an ethical concern, but for the analyst, because the analyst is called for by the suffering patient because of this demand to be cured, right? And we could even put it in more simple terms, because therapy is not doing enough, right? Therapy seems to sort of reorient and try to normalize the patient, and in a suffocating way, so that it doesn't even work. It's like a band-aid to cover up a wound, but that's all it does. And, psychoanalysis is able to address, something regarding suffering that psychology still cannot do, because it doesn't have a theory of jouissance, which is also the unconscious.
Through jouissance. The See, this is where I feel like this will be, obviously continuing conversation, but it's like the so psychoanalysis, the way it has been framed, is very much it's responding. Ethics, and this is where psychoanalysis would have a problem, but also at the same time, ethics is always also concerned with past the responding. So there is that. So basically, what I'm saying is, once psychoanalysis does its job, what then? And I feel like the response, I feel like the response is, because I always see a combination with psychoanalysis, right? It's usually like it's paired with Marxism, right? And to me, I feel like psychoanalysis has that response. Marxism provides the more future-oriented striving towards that end. But to me, this space in which Marxism exists is precisely the realm of the ethical from a philosophical point of view. Like, so for me, what I'm saying is, could it be possible to entertain the idea that actually the reason why ethics is insufficient is precisely because what has to be done is that one must go through psychoanalysis, then be ethical? Because what you can do is now you have a feedback loop. Psychoanalysis can do the checking on the subject, right? And then you're able to hold something like a Marxist psychoanalytic framework. Like, for me, I'm like, why is that possible? Why should that be possible if psychoanalysis does not already leave this kind of place or realm in which one can now think from the future with psychoanalysis? Because, like, so far it's been psychoanalysis very much concerned about the subject, the way it's constituted, the modern subject, how it lacks, how it must demystify truth, suffering, etc., etc. So there does seem to be a space created from that very elimination that psychoanalysis is attempting to do. That is why I think whatever it is, an ethics is possible, because it does seem to be that the very framework in which psychoanalysis gets coupled up with seems to be like, psychoanalysis seems to be the very purification filter in which ethics actually does become possible. That's the ironic, I feel like that's the kind of ironic point. And it's and that it becomes the filter in which we always have to go through in order to maintain that ethics. Because it, if not, then we keep collapsing into a kind of self-irony and acting from our pathologies. So it would be like, how can I imagine an ethics where I actually realize it's a part of my own jouissance, a part of my own, I participate in my own delusion sometimes. You know, like the fact of like a strange ethics in which one is aware, ironically, of these downfalls, pitfalls. I feel like it's possible from that point. I guess, because I guess it's a question of, it's not whether, I guess maybe this is the more formulated question is, can there be an ethics after psychoanalysis? Which to me, I feel like, well, I mean, I think the proof is there in the sense of like, yeah, everybody combines Marxism with psychoanalysis. Why? Well, I mean, of course, there's the dialectic and that makes it good, but it's really, I think it's because without psychoanalysis, then Marxism can't be the ethical vision that it wants to be. Am I wrong on that? It can't be the ethical vision that it wants to be?
And that's an interesting question, just because, like, well, there's also the problem of, does Marx have an ethical vision in his theory, and even Marxism, because, like, one would argue, well, exploitation seems to have some type of ethical implications, but exploitation is not necessarily an ethical concern necessarily, but one could derive an ethical system. And I know, like, someone like what's her name? I think it's Vanessa Wills. She's a Marxist thinker, and she has this. I think it's an actual text that she wrote called like Marx's ethical vision, or the ethical vision in Marx. And I know Daniel Tutt had a interview with her in DC, and then C. Derek Varn has talked with her. A handful of people, Ben Burgess, who I don't know if he would consider himself a Marxist, is more of just like a sort of socialist, but adheres to sort of interesting trend in Marxism called analytic Marxism. But I don't necessarily think that like Marxism needs psychoanalysis to be able to, like, maybe if I understand what you're saying, to realize its sort of ethical vision. I do think that if there's something along the lines of an ethical dimension in Marxism, it's this sort of historical trend and theoretical trend of humanism, right? That exists within the humanist dimension. And I know Domenico Lacerdo is big on the humanism aspect as the Hegelian recognition materialized through Marxism and Marx and Engels, because of the way that the theory of recognition allows for slaves to be like, I am neither recognized as a subject nor as a human being, um, while being in servitude. So in that sense, you could see some implicit ethical demands, because at one, it's not only to be recognized as a subject, but also to being recognized as a human, a subject with rights, but also a human being. And I'm neither both because I'm a slave. So therefore, the theory and demand of recognition, the Hegelian recognition, is important for Lacerda, and he will argue that this is important for Marxism, not just as like, oh, the proletariat versus the capitalist, but also um, the forms of domination that exist even today, whether it's slavery, colonialism, sexual oppression. But I think for the sort of consistency of our conversation regarding psychoanalysis, I do think, like, in a sense, what you're saying, like, it aligns with me intuitively. It's like, ethics and philosophy will always exist. Psychoanalysis is not going to get rid of that, and I don't think its point is to get rid of that, nor is it to get rid of science for that term. Like, those are going to exist. They've existed before psychoanalysis, and they will probably continue to exist, whether or not psychoanalysis will continue to exist. Um, and I think, in a sense, it's like, almost, yeah, it's like as if psychoanalysis allows us to be able, if we are interested in philosophy, if we're interested in science, if we're interested in the human condition, to create a discourse about it, that it would need to be able to demystify its pathologies. And I think, philosophy without a sort of a delusion and a sort of idealism and a sort of mystification needs to be purged in order to think of a, I guess, for lack of a better term, a clear and coherent system of ethics, as well as like the ontological and the epistemological. Um, and I think, really, to drive the point home about what the end looks like for psychoanalysis, and it's not just about the cure, the question concerning the cure through the talking, it's also a matter of sublimation. And Lacan will show, it's like, there is no sexuality without sublimation. This is his divergence from Freud, because we have these unconditioned sexual impulses and instincts, and it's by renouncing them to be integrated into society, I am forced to sublimate them into something socially acceptable. Whereas Lacan says, like, no, like, sexuality itself is sublimation. Like, there is no sexuality without sublimation. This is where it's like this sort of contradiction or antinomy of the fact that the sexual drive is elided in its aim towards its object, and at the same time still gets satisfaction in the form of sublimation. So this is what makes him come to, like, see, maybe not as like necessarily sexuality and sublimation as literally one of the same thing, but like as an antinomy. And this is where he says, it's like, the moment I'm not fucking, I'm talking to you right now. And yet at the same time, I could still get enjoyment talking to you if I were fucking. The question is, am I talking to you right now, or am I fucking? And so, in that joke, what he's getting at is the fact is that when a patient is able to, or an analysand, or somebody working with their symptom is able to sublimate, it's something that is either equal or different to their satisfaction from their drive, that is actually undermining them in this elision and sublimation. So in some instances, you go from, constantly, like, isolating themselves to then going on a binge of overly socialization, creating toxic relationships, doing a lot of drugs and partying, and then ghosting everybody, The type of people that also like to like constantly activate and deactivate their social media accounts and never have a single post on their thing, but always posting on their story. Um, that type of like figure. I'm not gonna say that they're all like that, but like, this type of personality. And then like, they go through analysis and it may be a long time, but then maybe they decide to actually start to get involved in political activism and get the same enjoyment, right? There's something about like engaging and disengaging, right? Engaging the other into an excess and then disengaging into a moment of solitude, right? Or maybe that's getting into religious practice for them, right? Where they get the same equal and different form of enjoyment through the process of sublimation, right? And so in order to think about the ethical vision, it's not only desire for psychoanalysis, if we could say that there is an ethical vision, but it's also one of understanding, again, jouissance, as I said earlier, but now jouissance as sublimation, right?
There seems to be something mean like, and I mean like virtue mean
Mm-hmm.
in Lacan, especially when he talks about like the analyst, right? You can't get too close. That's actually a very virtue ethics kind of based idea of you can't get too close because then actually you get screwed.
Yeah.
And then you can't be too far because then now you can't even engage with the patient. So you have to have this kind of, but the misunderstanding with Aristotle's mean is that most people think of it like, I'm not saying that you're thinking about it this way, but like just the audience of just like, most people think it's like, oh, this kind of middle way, average way. No, it's geometrical meaning. Like it means that it's possible that the excess of something might actually be the better appropriate. Getting closer to the excess is the more appropriate response versus perhaps in a certain situation, getting closer to the deficiency might be a more appropriate response. So I do feel like psychoanalysis has this kind of dance-like maneuver where it sort of like depends. Like, how do you want to sublimate your enjoyment? Well, once you know, and I feel like maybe this is a shot in the dark here. It's possible that psychoanalysis actually refines a virtue ethics of means. Precisely because now I'm taking into account my own pathology, my own tendency towards illusion. I have my own enjoyment, which also causes me suffering. Okay, so how can I navigate that world after psychoanalysis? Well, psychoanalysis seems to already draw those borders, right? Here's going too far, here's going too little, but we're not going to give you the answer as to what you should do, which is, to me, precisely what a kind of virtue ethics kind of aiming at the mean is exactly. How do you live post-psychoanalysis is understanding the borders in which this is too much, this is too little, you're enjoying too much, you're enjoying not enough, this is too much suffering, this is not enough suffering. Like there seems to be this kind of dance that this is why, like, I agree that the ethical injunction is pathological, but I think when it comes to the idea of like how virtue ethics circles around the mean itself, it actually becomes very unclear exactly what is the injunction per se, because it's so predicated on the context of the situation and exactly on my own ignorance and how I'm responding to this. I just feel like psychoanalysis sort of refines the borders in which and how we should respond versus it's so simple, supposedly. It's not that simple. But yeah, I'll be curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, yeah, and I meant to talk about this, but I mean, I think that's why there's, obviously a text written on Kant and Lacan with deontology, and psychoanalysis by Alenka, because I mean, it's about like the non-pathological action, right? And I think this goes very well to like the whole thing that Lacan and even Zizek will reiterate, about like even if you act on sort of your ethical injunction, that there's a sort of validation of the pathological aspect than it is on adhering to the ethical injunction or the ethical duty. Like the jealous husband who believes that his wife is cheating on him, and even if he is correct that his wife is cheating, it's not because that it's actually the case, but that he needs to justify his own pathological jealousy. It's his pathological jealousy that drives him to believe that his wife is cheating and has done the deed. It's not the deed that's happening that's making him inquire the investigation, but his own jealousy, right? His own pathology drives him towards a sort of disposition to expose the unethical act, the infidelity, right? And I don't think that's not exactly what Kant wants at all. Kant is not trying to base an action, even if it is most noble, most virtue, on something pathological. And so to think about like what is the goodwill then? And I think in some sense, like we're dealing with something even in Kant that like Kant didn't realize in himself about like sort of the real antinomy that comes between the choice that is made of following one's duty. And I know like he doesn't really talk about means much as more as ends, right? Because so for friends, for him, people in friendship are ends, not means to an end. But I get what you're saying about like for virtue, it's means, purely means. Like we could say it's like aims as well. And like when one's aim, you could say is not like sort of or means is not pathological, um, or self-invested because you see the way that virtue ethics and the Stoic bros and like the Ryan Holiday dudes are just like commodifying Stoicism. It's not even like prior that like Stoicism was better. I think like Stoicism is still like kind of flawed in its own way. But I think like with the way that virtue is appropriated to be like the sort of masturbatory exercise, that it kind of defeats the purpose that I think that someone like Aristotle would want to talk about the function of ethics in an Athenian society. Because I think there's more of a polis aspect to him. There's more of a communal thing about virtue. I mean, even for ancient Christian ethics, virtue was important. It had different virtues like charity, humility, etc. And I think maybe like for psychoanalysis, if something like virtue or something like looking at aims and means, I think maybe it can be cultivated over time. It doesn't necessarily mean that one will be virtuous, that psychoanalysis makes one virtuous.
Right.
Khan has been saying that since seminars too.
Right.
But like, I think, as a therapeutic effect that psychoanalysis has, I think one may, and again, I said it takes courage to constantly talk about the most mundane, which has pathological intricacies to it, to the most embarrassing and shameful things regarding your own willingness to undermine yourself, the way you undermine others, the way that you lie, the way that you literally treat your analysts like shit, the way that you treat people like shit, and in all these different petty dimensions that you're able to expose your own infallibility or your own fallibility. When you deem everybody as fallible and you're infallible, but then when the analyst points it out, then you're caught within the gaze of your own desire. And so I think maybe for some people that could cultivate an ethical virtue of modesty, temperance, right? Prudence, maybe.
Well, what I want to add is that I think Lacan, I mean, like, it's so hard for me to think like Lacan, not like a dark night of the soul kind of thing.
Oh, I think there's some strong influence, of course. I mean, you and I both talked to Mark Gerard Murphy, and he's big on the homology between Saint John and Lacan, and I wouldn't doubt it. I think
But I
he
think
is.
I want to play out how this sounds to you, because there's actually a part in Aquinas. I can never find it, but I know I read it with Jockin because it's super crazy. It's like virtue ethics, when it becomes perfected, one forgets that one is being virtuous. So I feel like a Lacanian, or I feel like a psychoanalytic virtue ethics would be The one that is virtuous is the one that doesn't know that they are virtuous. But the only way that you get to that point is through the mitigation of the self-filtering of psychoanalysis. Precisely because it's going to keep telling you that, oh, actually, you keep thinking yourself as virtuous, and this is pathological. And I think I mean, to be honest, I actually don't see any contradiction in this between the idea of like an actual self-forgetting of oneself in the virtuous thing. It's the point of the fact that one actually forgets that one is, or doesn't know that one is. So I think more probably in psychoanalysis is more like unsaid. It's left unsaid, and it's perhaps better left unsaid, precisely because if said, if pointed out, then one would already begin to fall into that delusion of, oh wow, I am virtuous. Like the moment this is like so symptomatic of like spiritual materialism. Of like the moment I start thinking of myself as virtuous, I'm fucked. Like it's such a funny like, and I think it corresponds with like Lacan. It's just like it's such a funny like thing of just like the moment I think I am, I'm actually screwed. Like I actually just screwed myself.
Yeah, I mean that's the whole thing about his inversion of the Cartesian subject of the cogito, not as I think, therefore I am, but rather this choice between thinking and being. And if I'm thinking, then I compromise my being. But if I'm being, then I compromise thinking the thing that I want to think. And to be is not to be like in existence necessarily, but to be there somewhere where I am not at the moment, unconscious FOMO. No, but like, there's this, way in which like what it is to be there is to be at the sort of point in which I could experience the point of satisfaction that was lost and I'm trying to refine, right? And this is what inaugurates the pleasure principle of trying to aim at this point of homeostasis where excitation is brought at to a minimum, which mimics this primordial satisfaction that was given to me at an early age, but I feel cut off from. And I think like, it's like not just that, some things need to be left unsaid, but it's like you won't be able to say it all. The truth is always half said. That's why Lacan says at the beginning of television, I speak the truth, or at least I try to. You can't say it all. It is impossible to say the entire truth. Right? So the unconscious is only coughing up half said truths, never the full truth. Right. And this is part of the process of, even what Freud writes about of like this idea of remembering, repeating and working through, right? You're remembering something, it goes back to again the unconscious formations of the memory of your own pathology, your own symptom. In some ways you repeat it in different forms, whether in real life when you leave the session or in dreams, and these repetitions of these motifs haunt you so much that you have to just constantly fixate and work through them in analysis for an hour and a half, or the next session over and over again, so you realize that, oh, really there was nothing there to it, it's just a fixation because this is just something that's just eliding you from just working through, right? Which is just to work through it. You keep staying stuck on there, but it's all an illusion. Like it's all just like something to really just deceive in the fact that there was nothing there in that person or in that moment that you fantasize about, of wanting to go back to 1985 or wanting to go back to the times where like your family was like this and now they're not. These are all just like phantasms that are haunting you, and to why it's not only just the fact that maybe they shouldn't be spoken about right then and there, or maybe the analyst's job is to intervene at a certain point. We're almost getting at something, but we're going to work on it in the next session. Let's leave it at here, but maybe we should think about this thing that you said regarding the way in which you mentioned this word, the way that you're recounting how whenever you felt like this as a kid that your father would snap at you. But then it's interesting how in all these previous sessions you're talking about I'm afraid to snap at someone. So it's like interesting how this came up. So let's think about and then talk about the next session, right? Of course, it doesn't always have to be about the family, but it's just so common and stereotypical to always bring that up because of psychoanalysis. And why I bring like up like this whole thing about like intervening or at least stopping and not understanding right away, getting at it just at one moment until we have to intervene and then have you think about it so that you could be in this temporal moment of logical understanding. Because even if you get at the truth at that moment, it doesn't mean that it's going to apply to the next time when you're talking about the same thing. And we can start heading towards maybe a conclusion to this conversation. But Lacan will say this about the importance of repetition and learning from the death drive. And he gives this example of a French fairy tale of the boy named Gribouillet, who's like a hero, but like he's like an idiot boy. Like to save the world from burning, he throws himself into the fire, right? Or to in fear of drowning, he jumps into the water and drowns. And so like this sort of like irony, but the story that he's talking about is like Gribouillet walks into a funeral after having seen the family in so long, and he goes, "Many happy returns." And then the family starts pulling his hair, beating him up, and is like, "You're not supposed to say that. You're at a funeral. You're supposed to say, 'May God rest his soul.'" And so 2 weeks later, he goes to a wedding, and right when the groom is about to say his vows, he says, "May God rest his soul." And then he gets beaten up. So here's the moral story is like just because you get at half of the truth doesn't mean that truth will apply to the next point in which the truth emerges again, right? Because you're always understanding too soon or too late.
Mm. Yeah, I mean it's like it's almost like a virtue ethics without. And this is why virtue ethics is always situational. So it's actually kind of enlightens my understanding of virtue ethics in the sense of like there's always a half truths in an ethical situation, in which you can't even rely on the past framework to like apply to this framework because it's always going to be incomplete. But then also this other thing that psychoanalysis is adding, but then also like I think the religious understanding also gets at this too, which is this idea of detachment. Once you have fixation, you have to go through detachment, and it's this constant practice of detachment. And it seems like psychoanalysis is definitely concerned with the fixation of just like, yeah, there's nothing, you had nothing there. There was a phantasm. So I'm working to always undo the very thing that you want to pathologically fixate every single time. Now, I think this is where exactly the ethical life actually does begin, because it's precisely what allows you to be ethical, I would say. I would like to like actually be ethical without the, and it's an ethical subject in which they always have to fight back their own fixation, right? And then to eventually get to the point of being the virtuous person that doesn't know they're virtuous, because that to me that's the only way in which you could actually be. I mean, it's almost like imagine a society that is excellent that doesn't know it's excellent. It would have to be that. It would have to be something like that. How do you create a polis that doesn't know it's a great polis? like you know, something of that kind of nature, of that ironic move of because if they say it's a great polis, now it's an illusion.
It would have to be grounded in a noble lie.
Yeah. It have to be grounded in a noble lie. Yeah, that's right. Okay, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you have anything.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything other than the fact, like, I think, like, to kind of like reinstate, like, what, like, I guess this conversation is saying. I think, like, one of the main things is like, yeah, like, this isn't necessarily an aporia of like, does psychoanalysis have an ethics or is it ethically oriented? I think it is. Yeah, like the unconscious is the ethical dimension, but I think that the ethical dimension isn't a system of knowledge, right? It's not a sort of
Now,
pateia, a paideia of insight to which you initiate in, like, in Greek society. It's not like maxims that one needs to hold, like the categorical imperative. But I think, like, insofar as that there is aim and there is desire, that it puts us into like this forced choice that we cough up to the analyst, and when the analyst interprets and relays that message back in inverted form, we realize the nonsensicality of the dilemma and the ultimatums we put ourselves in, which go back to this abstract notion of to think or to be, right? To think myself in this situation, or to be actually right here. And I talked about like Sartre's thing about like should I tend to my sick mother, or should I go avenge my brother's death and join the army to fight the Nazis, right? And so, like, it's not that any of those are more ethical than the other, but at the
right.
same time, is the aim in and of itself a pathological nonsensicalness, and then is there a guilt that comes from choosing one over the other, right? uh
Mhm.
that also has not a sort of ethical consequence, but the pathological one. And so when we think of the ethics and psychoanalysis relationship to it, sort of dilemmas, ultimatums, antinomies, and contradictions that may not only arise because of pathology, but maybe there's also something as of an antinomy with this pathology itself. Because when I was talking about sublimation and satisfaction of the drive, right? That's what psychoanalysis exposes. So maybe that ties in as well. So, and just to elaborate, it's like philosophy and scientific existed way before psychoanalysis and will continue to exist afterwards. But it's like, what is, I guess our conversation is like, what is psychoanalysis' role in its ethical dimension? Not to mention Lacan had an entire seminar on the ethics, and the ethical implications of the unconscious and desire. What can that tell us about all the ethics that philosophy has tarried, so long with? Because it's not that philosophy have solved the ethical problems. But I think when we introduce new things like the unconscious and desire and jouissance, I think maybe we could get at something a lot more. Um, we could create an Archimedean point to where we could think about the problems in a different light. We could sublate, maybe. We could think dialectically. Yeah.
We can maybe sublate.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, yeah, I think that's good. I think that's a good starting. Like it's a good point of
Yeah.
conversation.
And I would say if there are two ethical systems that do actually hold up to scrutiny, even if psychoanalysis, like, maybe has been critical of them, it is going to be virtue and deontology. I think this is why, like, he is so interested in Aristotle with aim, and the categorical imperative with Kant, right? Those are the only two ones that he really addresses the most, because he realizes that, of course, utilitarianism is like impossible. Yeah.
Well, it's funny because like this will be like my piece. Like I look at virtue deontology as like I stuff them in the framework of like Saint John of the Cross, because like the first night of sense is where the origin pathological sense of virtue ethics begins, which is the restraining, confining of desire. And you're getting pleasure from this, and it's great and it's good. And then all of a sudden, it gets taken away from you. So now you got to enact the Kantian duty of this dryness to combat the spiritual dryness. And how do you navigate that? Because you're not getting anything from like God's teeth anymore. So you got to just do the duty. But then you reach this other point where it's like, wait a second, how is it that now I'm gaining pleasure after going through these kind of brutality? And I feel like at this point now it's like we're getting to this kind of self-forgetting jouissance kind of like state of being where it's like no longer the concern is about the ethics, but like the pleasure seems to be corresponding with the suffering. Versus like this more like pure enjoyment in the more crude common sense, not the enjoyment or jouissance that Lacan would talk about, but it's the one that is always sort of self delude, like it's filters out through its own self delusions somehow in some way, and that would be the only to me that's the only ethics that's viable. Like if we think about it processually, if we think about it in process, because I think a lot of people think like they collapse this idea of like, okay, well, ethics has to be this neat aim and end. It's like, okay, cool, you get that from Aristotle, but then Aristotle, it doesn't like give you the full like pathological accounts of what one experiences when one pursues virtue. And this is why I think like psychoanalysis is quite helpful. It's like, okay, because we underestimated the scope of this terrain of when one pursues virtue, what is exactly all the pathological dangers that one could fall into. And I guess this is why Mark Murphy does kind of make that connection between like St. John of the Cross, because the mystics are the ones creating manuals about virtue itself. Because it's not straightforward. It's like actually you do fall into your own self-aggrandizement precisely because you are doing these rituals, and it actually, you're not serving God, you're actually worshiping the ritual itself. You're loving the ritual, right? The ritual is now the obstacle to the very thing you desire. So you just screwed yourself. So it's yeah, I think psychoanalysis is pivotal to this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. The last thing I'll say is like, because you mentioned Thomas Aquinas a lot, the concept of symptom, right? Symptom, the symptom, is a play off of Saint Thomas Aquinas.
That's good.
Yeah, and Lacan actually privileges the notion of the saint. So that's also another thing to keep in mind. He has this like idea of like the character of the saint as being pivotal to understanding like the sort of subject that undergoes there's like working through their symptom as synonymous with the saint, or like as a sort of like position to be in as a subject, the saint.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, I'd like to know more about that. But all right,
for sure. Yeah.
We'll end it like a Lacanian style. You left me with I'll think about that. I want to think about the symptom.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys for watching.
Yeah.
Pleasure having you, Big Sig.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a pleasure to come back on again. I really like our conversations, and so I feel like next time if we do this, it's going to get deeper and deeper. So.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I'll have to give like more of a better count of beauty, but that's another conversation. We'll keep building on this. But all right, well, thank you guys for watching. All right, so let me see if I can end this now.